I never told my wife that I am the anonymous investor with $10 billion worth of shares in her father's company. She always saw me living simply. One day, she invited me to have dinner with her parents. I wanted to see how they would treat a poor, naive man. But as soon as they slid an envelope across the table... Chapter 1. Daniel Morgan was born in a neighborhood where hope was rationed and dreams came with expiration dates. His childhood home sat wedged between a laundromat that never closed and a convenience store that had been robbed so many times the owner stopped bothering to replace the broken security camera. The apartment building stood 3 stories tall with paint peeling like sunburned skin. And every night Daniel fell asleep to the sounds of arguments filtering through paper-thin walls, the wail of sirens racing toward some fresh disaster, and his mother's quiet, weeping as she counted coins on the kitchen table under a flickering fluorescent light. His father had left when Daniel was 4 years old, walking out with nothing but a duffel bag and a promise to send money that never materialized into anything more than empty words dissolving into silence. Daniel's mother Maria worked 2 jobs, cleaning office buildings before dawn and serving tables at a diner until midnight, her hands perpetually raw and her eyes perpetually tired. She never complained, not once, but Daniel saw the exhaustion etched into every line of her face, carved deeper with each passing year like words written in flesh. From the earliest age that Daniel could remember, he understood that money was not just currency but survival itself, the difference between eating and hunger, between warmth and cold, between staying in their crumbling apartment and joining the families he saw sleeping in cars or under highway overpasses. He learned to count pennies before he learned to read chapter books, sorting coins into neat piles on the floor while his mother slept, calculating in his child's mind how many more she would need to pay the electric bill or buy his school supplies. Other children played with toys, but Daniel played with numbers, finding in them a logic and order that the chaotic world around him utterly lacked. He discovered that mathematics never lied, never broke promises, never disappeared in the night leaving only absence behind. Numbers became his friends, his refuge, his secret language for understanding a universe that otherwise made no sense. When Daniel turned 8 years old, he found a discarded newspaper in a trash can and saw something that would alter the trajectory of his entire life. The business section lay crumpled and coffee-stained, filled with columns of stock prices and market analyses that meant nothing to most people, but to Daniel, they appeared as beautiful and mysterious as ancient hieroglyphics waiting to be decoded. He smuggled that newspaper home like stolen treasure and spent hours staring at the numbers, trying to understand the patterns, the rises and falls, the hidden logic that governed how wealth flowed from one place to another. He began collecting more newspapers, digging through recycling bins behind office buildings, building a library of financial pages that he stored under his bed like sacred texts. His mother found him once at 3 a.m, hunched over a calculator he had bought at a yard sale for 50 cents, filling notebooks with equations and predictions about stocks he could not afford to buy. She asked him what he was doing with such worry in her voice that Daniel felt ashamed, as though he had been caught doing something wrong. But he explained in his small voice that he was learning how money worked, how people who had money made more money, how there were rules and patterns that if you could just understand them might let you change everything. Maria Morgan knelt down beside her son that night, her knees creaking from years of hard labor, and she took his face in her work-roughened hands and told him something he would never forget. She said that being poor was not a moral failing, that poverty did not make a person less worthy or less intelligent, but that the world was designed by those with wealth to keep wealth circulating among their own kind, while everyone else fought for scraps. She told him that if he truly wanted to change his life, he would have to become better than good, work harder than hard, and never, ever let anyone make him believe he deserved less because of where he started. She told him that she was proud of him, and that if he kept studying those numbers with the same dedication she saw in his eyes, one day he might not just understand money but master it completely. From that moment forward, Daniel approached his education with a ferociousness that frightened his teachers and isolated him from his peers. While other students in his underfunded public school barely paid attention, Daniel absorbed every lesson as though his life depended on it, because in many ways it did. He read every book in the small school library, then began walking to the public library, 3 miles away, to devour their collection. He taught himself advanced mathematics from textbooks meant for high school students, then college students, checking out books on economics and finance and business strategy that he read under blankets with a flashlight after his mother thought he was asleep. His teachers noticed his extraordinary aptitude and tried to help when they could, providing him with additional materials and writing recommendation letters for scholarship programs. But the system was not designed to catch children like Daniel before they fell through its widening cracks. By the time Daniel reached middle school, he had developed a reputation as the weird poor kid who never talked about sports or music but could calculate compound interest in his head and held opinions about Federal Reserve policy. He had no friends, not really, because friendship required time and money he did not have, required going to movies or buying pizza or doing all the things normal teenagers did together. Instead, Daniel worked, taking jobs that paid under the table because he was too young for legal employment, mowing lawns and delivering newspapers and helping the elderly man down the hall carry groceries in exchange for a few dollars here and there. Every penny he earned went into a coffee can hidden in his closet, and every penny in that coffee can represented a promise he had made to himself and to his mother that they would not always live this way. When Daniel was 13, his mother got sick. It started as a cough she insisted was nothing, just a cold that would pass, but it grew worse week by week until she could barely breathe without pain shooting through her chest. She refused to see a doctor because they had no insurance, and she knew what medical bills could do to people like them. New families that had been crushed under debt for daring to seek treatment they could not afford. Daniel watched helplessly as his mother's condition deteriorated, watched her grow thinner and paler and weaker until finally she collapsed at the diner during her shift. The ambulance took her to the county hospital where a tired doctor with kind eyes delivered news that shattered Daniel's world into pieces. She had pneumonia that had progressed into something more serious, and she needed treatment that would cost thousands of dollars they absolutely did not have. Daniel emptied his coffee can, every penny he had saved over years of work, and it amounted to $643. It was not enough, not even close, not even a fraction of what the hospital required. He sat beside his mother's bed holding her hand and feeling more powerless than he had ever felt in his life, understanding with terrible clarity that all his studying and all his intelligence meant nothing when the cruel mathematics of poverty calculated whether someone lived or died. But Maria Morgan looked at her son with fever-bright eyes and made him promise something. She made him promise that he would not quit school to work full-time, that he would not sacrifice his future to save her present, that he would continue his education no matter what happened, because that was the only path out of the trap they were born into. She made him promise, and because he loved her more than anything in the world. Daniel promised, even though the words tasted like betrayal in his mouth. His mother survived, barely, discharged from the hospital with medications she could not afford and bills that would haunt them for years. She returned to work too soon because they needed money desperately, and Daniel watched her health never quite recover, watched her age a decade in the span of months. The experience marked him in ways that ran deeper than trauma, carved into his soul an understanding that wealth was not about luxury or comfort but about power, about having the ability to protect the people you loved, about never having to choose between medicine and rent or food and electricity. He became even more determined, working harder, studying longer, pushing himself past the point of exhaustion because every moment wasted was a moment his mother spent suffering, and he refused to let her sacrifice be meaningless. Daniel graduated from high school at 16, 2 years early, with perfect grades and test scores. That made scholarship committees pay attention despite his complete lack of connections or legacy. He received a full scholarship to the state university, not a prestigious Ivy League institution but a solid school that would give him the education he needed. His mother cried when he showed her the acceptance letter, tears of joy mixed with sorrow, because she knew it meant he would move away to the campus 3 hours distant. On the day Daniel left for college, Maria Morgan gave him the only thing of value she owned, a small golden locket that had belonged to her own mother, and she told him to sell it if he ever needed money. Daniel never sold that locket, wearing it always on a chain under his shirt where it rested against his heart like a talisman, a reminder of everything he was fighting for and everyone he could not fail. Chapter 2. University life presented Daniel with a world he had only glimpsed from the outside, a world of students who complained about their allowances being late while he worked 3 part-time jobs to afford food beyond the meal plan his scholarship provided. He studied finance and economics because those subjects represented the language of power, the grammar of wealth, the syntax of control that he needed to master. His professors quickly recognized that Daniel Morgan was not like the other students who drifted through lectures planning their weekend parties. Daniel arrived early, stayed late, asked questions that demonstrated he had not only read the assigned material but researched far beyond it. He challenged assumptions, proposed alternative theories, and demonstrated an intuitive understanding of market forces that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere academic study. One professor in particular, Dr. Richard Chen, took special interest in Daniel's development. Dr. Chen had built and sold 2 successful companies before returning to academia, and he recognized in Daniel the hunger that characterized true entrepreneurs, the relentless drive that separated those who succeeded from those who merely dreamed. He began mentoring Daniel privately, lending him books from his personal collection, introducing him to concepts like venture capital and private equity and algorithmic trading that the standard curriculum barely touched. Dr. Chen also taught Daniel something equally important, that in the world of high finance, perception mattered as much as reality. That the wealthy dressed and spoke and carried themselves in particular ways that signaled their membership in an exclusive club. He taught Daniel which forks to use at formal dinners, how to tie a proper Windsor knot, how to make small talk about opera and wine and other cultural markers that the upper class used to identify their own. Daniel absorbed these lessons with the same intensity he brought to everything else, understanding that code switching was not betrayal but strategy, that adopting the mannerisms of the wealthy did not mean abandoning his origins, but rather acquiring tools to navigate their world. He spent hours in the library watching videos of business leaders giving presentations, mimicking their body language and speech patterns, training himself to project confidence and authority even when he felt like an imposter. He bought one good suit from a thrift store and had it carefully tailored to fit perfectly, understanding that he could not afford many clothes but could afford to make what he had look impeccable. Every detail mattered, every choice was strategic, because Daniel had learned that the world judged you in the first 7 seconds. And he could not afford to waste a single one of those seconds confirming stereotypes about poor kids who did not belong. During his sophomore year, Daniel made his first real investment. He had saved $800 from his various jobs, money that most people would have used for necessities or small comforts, but Daniel saw opportunity where others saw risk. He had been tracking a small pharmaceutical company that was developing a treatment for a rare disease, studying their clinical trial results and patent filings and FDA submission timeline. The stock was trading at $3 per share, and most analysts ignored it. Because the company was tiny, and the disease affected relatively few people. But Daniel's research suggested that the treatment would receive approval, and that approval would trigger acquisition interest from larger pharmaceutical companies looking to expand their portfolios. He invested his entire $800, buying 266 shares, and then he waited with the patience of someone who understood that wealth was built not through luck but through information advantage and iron discipline. 6 months later, the FDA approved the treatment. 2 weeks after that, a major pharmaceutical company announced they were acquiring Daniel's small firm at a price of $41 per share. Daniel sold his shares for a profit of over $10,000, turning his $800 investment into wealth that felt infinite compared to everything he had known. He could have spent that money, could have bought a car or new clothes, or relieved some of the pressure that came from working so many jobs. Instead, Daniel reinvested every penny, splitting his capital across 3 different opportunities he had researched with the same meticulous care. Over the next 2 years, he repeated this pattern again and again, making careful, calculated bets based on deep research rather than gambling on tips or following trends. Some investments failed, but more succeeded, and his portfolio grew steadily as he developed an almost supernatural ability to identify undervalued companies before the market corrected. By the time Daniel reached his senior year, his investment portfolio had grown to over $200,000, a sum that would have seemed impossible to the child counting pennies on the floor. But Daniel told no one, not his classmates, not even his professors, because he understood. That money changed how people perceived you, and he was not ready for that change. He continued living in the cheapest dormitory, continued wearing his one carefully maintained suit, continued working his part-time jobs, even though he no longer financially needed them. The jobs kept him grounded, kept him connected to the reality of what most people experienced, kept him from losing sight of why he was doing any of this. Every week he sent money home to his mother, never so much that she would ask questions but enough to make her life slightly easier, to ensure she could afford her medications, and maybe take a rare day off without worrying about lost wages. Dr. Chen noticed Daniel's increasing sophistication in class discussions, the way he referenced market movements and company strategies with the specificity of someone who had skin in the game. During their final mentoring session before Daniel's graduation, Dr. Chen asked him directly how much he had accumulated through his investments. Daniel hesitated, then told him the truth, watching Dr. Chen's eyebrows rise in surprise and respect. Dr. Chen told him something important that day. He said that Daniel had a gift, a rare combination of analytical intelligence and psychological discipline that could not be taught, could only be cultivated. He said that most people who made money young immediately inflated their lifestyles to match their new wealth. But true power came from the gap between what you had and what people thought you had. He advised Daniel to continue living below his means, to build his empire in silence, and to reveal his strength only when revelation served a strategic purpose. He said that the wealthiest and most powerful people in the world were often those whose names appeared in no magazines and whose faces were unknown to the public, and that invisibility was its own kind of armor. Daniel graduated summa cum laude with a degree in finance and job offers from several investment banks that recruited heavily from his university. The offers came with starting salaries that would have seemed like lottery winnings to his younger self, $60,000 or $70,000 a year plus bonuses, more money than his mother had made in 5 years of back-breaking labor. But Daniel turned them all down, to the shock of his career counselor who insisted he was making a terrible mistake. Daniel had no intention of building someone else's empire, or making rich men richer, while receiving a salary and a pat on the head. He had learned enough, studied enough, and accumulated enough capital to begin his own path, and he knew that working in traditional finance would only slow him down. He had bigger plans, vaster visions, ambitions that required freedom and flexibility that no corporate position could provide. After graduation, Daniel rented a tiny studio apartment in a modest neighborhood, and set up what he called his operations center, which consisted of a used desk, 3 computer monitors purchased from a going-out-of-business sale, and a dedication to outworking everyone else in every market he entered. He registered an investment company under a generic name that revealed nothing about its owner, creating layers of legal structures that would keep his identity hidden from the companies he invested in. He did not want to be known, did not want his youth or his background to bias how people perceived his business decisions. He wanted his investments to speak for themselves, to be evaluated purely on merit rather than on the pedigree of the investor behind them. This anonymity would become the defining characteristic of his entire approach, the secret that would allow him to build an empire while walking the streets unrecognized and unknown. Chapter 3. The first 5 years after college were the hardest and most transformative of Daniel's life, years when he worked 18-hour days analyzing companies and markets and economic trends, years when he ate instant noodles for dinner, so he could reinvest every spare dollar into opportunities others missed. He developed a particular strategy that set him apart from other investors. While most people chased hot stocks and trending sectors, Daniel focused on finding fundamentally solid companies that were temporarily undervalued due to market overreaction or temporary setbacks. He looked for businesses with strong management teams, competitive advantages, and growth potential that the market had not yet recognized. He was not looking for quick flips or lucky breaks. He was looking for companies he could hold for years, maybe decades. Companies that would grow into giants while he patiently accumulated shares. His breakthrough came when he was 25 years old, though no one except Daniel himself knew it at the time. He had been tracking Harrison Industries for nearly a year, studying their quarterly reports, and product launches and strategic direction with obsessive attention to detail. Harrison Industries was a mid-sized manufacturing and technology company founded by Theodore Harrison 30 years earlier, built from a single factory into a diversified corporation with contracts spanning multiple industries. The company was successful but not spectacular, profitable but not exciting, the kind of solid business that attracted little attention from flashy investors looking for the next unicorn. But Daniel saw something others missed. He saw that Harrison Industries was positioned at the intersection of several emerging trends, that their manufacturing capabilities and technology patents would become increasingly valuable as certain sectors evolved, and that the company was dramatically undervalued because Theodore Harrison's conservative management style made them seem boring compared to more aggressive competitors. Daniel began accumulating shares slowly and carefully, buying small amounts through his anonymous investment vehicle in a way that would not trigger attention or move the market price significantly. He bought shares when other investors sold in frustration after quarters that met expectations but did not exceed them. He bought shares when market downturns caused indiscriminate selling. He bought shares whenever he could at reasonable prices, steadily building a position that grew larger month by month. Within 3 years, Daniel had invested nearly all of his capital into Harrison Industries, acquiring millions of shares through complex structures that kept his identity completely hidden. He owned approximately 15% of the company, making him by far the largest single shareholder, larger even than Theodore Harrison himself, who had gradually sold down his stake over the years to fund his lifestyle and diversify his wealth. But Daniel did not stop there. He continued studying the company, preparing analyses and strategic recommendations that he submitted anonymously through his investment firm whenever major decisions came before the board. As a major shareholder, he had voting rights, but he exercised those votes through layers of proxies that made it impossible to trace back to him personally. He voted for board members who understood long-term value creation over short-term profit maximization. He voted for strategic initiatives that would strengthen the company's competitive position even if they temporarily reduced margins. He voted against executive compensation packages that rewarded short-term stock price manipulation rather than fundamental business building. Slowly, without anyone knowing who was pulling the strings, Daniel shaped Harrison Industries into the company he believed it could become. The results spoke for themselves. Over the next several years, Harrison Industries' stock price began a steady climb as the market finally recognized what Daniel had seen all along. The company's value tripled, then quadrupled, then grew beyond even Daniel's optimistic projections as their strategic positioning paid off, and their products became essential to rapidly growing sectors. As the stock price rose, Daniel's investment grew from millions to tens of millions to hundreds of millions and finally crossed into the billions. By the time he was 30 years old, Daniel Morgan's stake in Harrison Industries was worth approximately $10 billion, making him one of the wealthiest individuals in the country, though, absolutely, no one except his lawyers and accountants knew his real identity. To the public, to the media, to even the company's own executives, the major shareholder was just a bland corporate name, an anonymous investment vehicle that appeared on disclosure forms but connected to no person, no story, no face. Daniel maintained his simple life throughout this extraordinary wealth accumulation with a discipline that bordered on the obsessive. He still lived in a modest apartment, drove a used car, bought his clothes from mid-range stores. He sent money to his mother, who had finally been able to retire from her exhausting jobs, but he told her only that his investments were doing well, not that he was now a billionaire. He had no interest in yachts or private jets or any of the ostentatious displays that characterized newly wealthy people desperate to prove their status. His wealth was not about consumption. It was about security, about power, about never being helpless again, about having the resources to protect everyone he loved, and to shape the world according to his vision of what was right and fair. Material possessions meant nothing to him beyond basic comfort and quality. What mattered was the number in his accounts, growing larger every quarter, representing not money, but possibility itself. During this period of wealth building, Daniel lived an oddly solitary existence. He dated occasionally, but nothing serious, because he did not know how. To navigate relationships when his entire life was built on a secret. How do you tell someone you are a billionaire when you live like you make $50,000 a year? How do you explain why you work from home analyzing spreadsheets instead of having a traditional job? How do you build intimacy while maintaining walls around the core truth of your identity? Most of the women he met assumed he was struggling financially, a smart guy who had not quite figured out how to turn his intelligence into prosperity, and Daniel never corrected their assumptions. He told himself that he was waiting for the right person, someone who would love him for who he was rather than what he had, but the truth was more complicated. The truth was that his secret had become so central to his identity that he no longer knew where the performance ended and the real Daniel began. Then, on a completely ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a completely ordinary coffee shop, Daniel's carefully constructed, solitary life collided with destiny in the form of Emma Harrison, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 4. Emma Harrison walked into the coffee shop with the kind of natural elegance that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with how she inhabited space, moving through the world with quiet confidence, but without arrogance. Daniel noticed her immediately, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because of the way she treated the young barista who had clearly messed up her order. Where most customers would have complained or shown irritation, Emma simply smiled and said it was fine, whatever they had made would be perfect, and that genuine kindness in such a small moment caught Daniel's attention in a way that calculated charm never could. She sat down at the table next to his, pulled out a laptop covered in stickers from various charities and causes, and became absorbed in her work with the focus of someone who cared deeply about what they were doing. Daniel found himself stealing glances at her over the top of his own laptop, watching the way she occasionally smiled at something on her screen or frowned in concentration, the way she absently tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear. He was not usually bold with strangers, had spent so many years protecting his privacy that approaching people felt risky and complicated, but something about this woman made him want to take a chance. When her phone rang and she stepped outside to take the call, Daniel noticed she had left her laptop behind, completely trusting in a world that often punished such trust. On impulse he bought 2 coffees, and when she returned he offered her one, saying he had accidentally ordered an extra, and would she like it rather than letting it go to waste. Emma looked at him with eyes that were both warm and discerning, assessing him for just a moment before accepting with a smile that transformed her entire face. She thanked him, and they fell into conversation with the easy naturalness of people who somehow already know they are supposed to meet. She asked what he did, and Daniel gave his standard vague answer, that he worked in financial consulting, which was technically true but concealed far more than it revealed. She told him she worked for a nonprofit focused on educational equity, helping low-income students access resources and opportunities that wealthier students took for granted. As she described her work, her passion became evident, the way she lit up talking about the kids she helped and the systemic barriers they worked to dismantle. Daniel found himself sharing more than he usually did, talking about his own childhood. In the poor neighborhood, his mother's struggles, the scholarship that changed his life. Emma listened with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions, making connections, treating his story not as something to pity, but as something valuable and real. She did not flinch when he mentioned growing up poor, did not change her demeanor, or make assumptions about what that meant regarding his intelligence or worth. In a world that often measured people entirely by their bank accounts and zip codes, Emma seemed to measure people by different metrics, entirely by their character and their kindness, and the substance of what they contributed to the world beyond themselves. They talked until the coffee shop began closing, until the barista started sweeping around their feet with pointed hints, and when they finally left, Daniel had her phone number and a date planned for the coming weekend, and a feeling in his chest that he could not quite name but knew was significant. Their first date stretched into 4 hours, then their second into 6, and by their third, Daniel understood with crystallizing clarity that Emma Harrison was not just someone he enjoyed spending time with, but someone who made him want to be more honest, more open, more fully himself. She had a way of seeing through surfaces to the truth underneath, of asking questions that got to the core of what mattered, of making space for authenticity in a world that rewarded performance. Daniel wanted to tell her everything, wanted to open up his entire life, and let her see all the pieces he kept hidden. But fear held him back. Fear that revealing his wealth would change how she looked at him, would introduce doubt about whether she loved him or his. Money would shift the dynamic from two equals building something together to something more complicated and transactional. It was not until their 8th or 9th date, when Emma offhandedly mentioned her last name in the context of a story about her father, that Daniel made the connection that sent ice water through his veins. Emma Harrison. Harrison. As in Harrison Industries. As in Theodore Harrison, the founder and CEO whose company Daniel owned $10 billion worth of shares in. The woman he was falling in love with was the daughter of the man whose business empire Daniel secretly controlled. The universe, it seemed, had a dark sense of humor, creating a situation so absurdly complicated that it would be comical if it were not so terrifying. Daniel's mind raced through implications and possibilities, wondering if this was somehow a setup, if Emma had known who he was all along, but the more he thought about it, the more impossible that seemed. She had no reason to connect a man living simply and working from home with the anonymous investor who held the largest stake in her father's company. No one made that connection because the connections were deliberately impossible to trace. Daniel knew he should tell her, should reveal at minimum that he was aware of who her father was, and that there were complications she should know about. But every time he tried to form the words, fear stopped his throat like a hand choking off air. Fear that telling her would end what they were building before it had a chance to fully form. Fear that she would think he had approached her deliberately, that their entire relationship was built on manipulation and hidden agendas. Fear that the secret he had protected so carefully for so many years would somehow leak out and destroy everything he had built. So Daniel said nothing, telling himself he would find the right moment later, and later turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and the secret grew heavier with each passing day. Emma took him to meet her parents after they had been dating for 6 months, and Daniel's first glimpse of Theodore Harrison in person was a shock to his system. The man was exactly as Daniel had imagined from reading years of shareholder letters and watching recorded presentations. Tall and distinguished with silver hair and the kind of presence that filled rooms and demanded attention. But there was something else too, something Daniel had not expected, a coldness in his eyes and a cruelty around his mouth that suggested he saw most people as tools to be used rather than humans to be respected. Emma's mother Patricia was different, softer and warmer, but also somehow faded, as though living with Theodore had gradually erased parts of her personality until only the parts he approved of remained. They lived in a mansion that looked like it belonged in architectural magazines, all marble and glass and expensive art, the kind of place that announced wealth with every detail. Dinner that first night was awkward and uncomfortable in ways that made Daniel's shoulders tense and his jaw clench. Theodore barely acknowledged Daniel's existence beyond a perfunctory handshake and a gaze that assessed and dismissed him within seconds. He spent the meal talking about business and politics and his own achievements occasionally, pausing to ask Daniel questions, clearly designed to highlight the gulf between them. What did Daniel's father do? Oh, absent. How unfortunate. Where did Daniel attend university? State school, perfectly adequate for some people. What exactly did financial consulting entail? Theodore's tone made it clear he considered Daniel's vague job description evidence of unemployment dressed up with fancy words. Emma tried to steer the conversation toward more inclusive topics, but Theodore dominated the table the way he probably dominated every room he entered, and Patricia simply smiled her faded smile and said nothing that might displease him. As the evening progressed, Daniel felt a strange cognitive dissonance settle over him. This man, who was treating him with barely concealed contempt, who was making it abundantly clear that Daniel was not good enough for his daughter, had no idea that Daniel controlled his company's future with a single vote. Theodore Harrison, who looked at Daniel and saw a poor boy playing above his station, was, in reality, dependent on Daniel's continued support for every major strategic decision. The irony was so profound it almost made Daniel laugh, but he maintained his calm exterior, playing the role of the humble boyfriend grateful for the invitation to the fancy house. He told himself it did not matter what Theodore thought, that Emma's opinion was all that mattered, but the disrespect stung more than he wanted to admit, awakening old wounds from childhood when teachers or store owners or friends, parents had looked at him and his mother with that same dismissive contempt. After that first dinner, Emma apologized profusely for her father's behavior, explaining that he was old-fashioned and protective, and had never thought anyone was good enough for her. She assured Daniel that her father's opinion did not matter to her, that she loved Daniel for who he was, not for whatever arbitrary standards her father imposed. Daniel told her it was fine, that he understood, but inside his mind was churning with questions and doubts. Should he tell her the truth about who he was? Would it make things better or worse? Would she believe he had approached her genuinely, or think the entire relationship was built on lies? The questions spiraled without answers, and so Daniel continued his silence, continued his simple life, continued letting everyone, including Emma, believe he was just an ordinary man trying to make his way in the world. Chapter 5. Emma and Daniel's relationship deepened over the following year, growing into the kind of love that felt both inevitable and miraculous, the kind that made them finish each other's sentences, and laugh at private jokes, and build a shared language of small moments and inside references. Emma never cared about money, never pushed Daniel to earn more or be more ambitious in traditional ways. She loved that he was thoughtful and kind and intelligent, that he volunteered at the same educational nonprofit where she worked, helping low-income students understand finance and investment in ways that might help them build their own paths out of poverty. She loved that he remembered small details about her day and asked questions about her work, and treated her like a full partner rather than a prize to be won or an accessory to display. When Daniel proposed after 18 months together, using his grandmother's simple gold band that he had been given after her passing, Emma said yes with tears streaming down her face, and said it was the most meaningful ring anyone could have given her. They planned a small wedding, which suited Daniel perfectly and disappointed Emma's parents enormously. Theodore Harrison expected a grand society affair with hundreds of guests and media coverage, and all the pageantry that came with marrying off the daughter of a successful businessman. But Emma insisted she wanted something intimate and personal, just close friends and family, a celebration of love, rather than a performance of status. The wedding took place in a small garden venue with 50 guests, and it was one of the happiest days of Daniel's life despite Theodore's obvious displeasure radiating from the front row. Emma looked at Daniel during their vows with such complete trust and love. That guilt crashed over him in waves. Guilt that he was still hiding such a fundamental truth about himself. Guilt that their marriage was beginning with a secret woven into its foundation like a crack in bedrock waiting to spread. After the wedding, Daniel and Emma moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a nice, but not extravagant, neighborhood, the kind of place that young professional couples might realistically afford. Emma never questioned why Daniel seemed content with their simple lifestyle, why he did not push for career advancement or express frustration with his financial consulting work that brought in enough money for comfortable living but nothing more. She had grown up with wealth and had seen how it often corrupted, how her father's obsession with money and status had made him mean and suspicious, how her mother had lost herself trying to meet impossible standards. Emma genuinely preferred their quiet life, preferred cooking dinner together and watching movies at home and taking walks in the park over the kind of expensive entertainment that Theodore considered basic necessities. But Theodore himself became an increasing source of tension in their marriage, not because Emma sided with her father but because his disapproval weighed on her like an oppressive fog. He made pointed comments at every family gathering about Daniel's lack of ambition, about how Emma could have married any number of successful young men from good families, about how disappointing it was that she had chosen someone so clearly beneath her station. Patricia would make weak attempts to change the subject, but Theodore overrode her every time, his voice growing louder and more cutting. He called Daniel the charity case when he thought Daniel was out of earshot. But Daniel heard it clearly and felt rage burn through him like acid. Emma would cry after these encounters, frustrated and hurt that her father could not simply be happy for her, could not see Daniel's worth beyond the superficial markers of career prestige and family connections. Daniel hated seeing Emma hurt, hated being the cause of conflict between her and her family, even though the fault lay entirely with Theodore's small-minded prejudice. There were moments when he almost told her the truth, when the words gathered on his tongue ready to spill out and end the charade. But every time he came close, doubt pulled him back. What if revealing his wealth made things worse instead of better? What if Emma felt betrayed that he had hidden such a significant truth for so long? What if she questioned whether his love was real, or whether he had manipulated her from the beginning? What if Theodore used the information somehow, tried to leverage Daniel's investment position for personal gain, or turned it into some kind of ugly business complication? The variables were too many, the risks too high, and so Daniel continued his silence, even as the weight of it grew heavier. 2 years into their marriage, Harrison Industries faced a significant crisis that would test both Daniel's investment strategy and his ability to maintain his secret life. A major product line failed spectacularly due to manufacturing defects, resulting in expensive recalls and damage to the company's reputation. The stock price plummeted by 40% in a matter of weeks, as investors panicked and analysts downgraded their ratings. Theodore Harrison's leadership came under fire from smaller shareholders who demanded his resignation, arguing that his conservative management style had made the company slow to respond to quality control issues. Board meetings became battlegrounds as different factions fought over how to proceed, whether to stay the course or make dramatic changes. Daniel watched all of this unfold with careful attention, analyzing the situation from every angle through the endless reports and filings that public companies were required to produce. His $10 billion stake had temporarily lost $4 billion in value on paper, but Daniel was not concerned about short-term price fluctuations. He had always invested for the long term, based on fundamental business strength rather than market sentiment. His analysis told him that the crisis was serious but manageable, that the company's core capabilities remained intact, and that Theodore Harrison's leadership, despite its flaws, was still the best option for navigating the recovery. Through his anonymous investment vehicle, Daniel voted to retain Theodore as CEO and to support the recovery plan the management team proposed. His votes were decisive, his 15% stake giving him more weight than any other shareholder, and the motions passed because of his support. Theodore never knew how close he came to losing his position, never knew that the anonymous investor he had occasionally cursed in private for wielding so much control had just saved his career. The irony twisted in Daniel's stomach every time he had to sit through another family dinner and listen to Theodore complain about how the board did not appreciate him properly, how shareholders only cared about quick profits and did not understand long-term value creation. Daniel sat silently and nodded politely while thinking that if Theodore knew the truth, knew that the largest shareholder was the son-in-law he treated with such contempt, the revelation might literally kill him from shock and rage. There was dark satisfaction in that thought, but also sadness, because Daniel took no joy in maintaining this elaborate deception, even as it felt increasingly impossible to escape. Emma noticed that Daniel seemed stressed during this period, asked him repeatedly if something was wrong, if there was anything he wanted to talk about. Daniel wanted to tell her everything, wanted to lay the whole truth at her feet and let her decide how to proceed, but the fear that had always stopped him remained a paralyzing force. Instead, he told her partial truths, that he was worried about market conditions, that he had some investments that were underperforming, that he was concerned about her father's company because he knew it affected her family. She thanked him for caring, told him that her father would be fine because he always landed on his feet, and said she was grateful Daniel was nothing like Theodore, that his kindness and humility were what she loved most about him. Her words were meant as comfort, but they cut like knives because Daniel knew his humility was at least partly performance, that he was hiding a kind of power and wealth that made him more like Theodore than she realized. Chapter 6. 3.5 years into their marriage, on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, Emma came home from work with news that made Daniel's heart sink into his stomach. Her mother Patricia had called to invite them to dinner that weekend. A special occasion because it was Theodore's 65th birthday. Patricia wanted to have an intimate family dinner, just the four of them, to celebrate quietly rather than with the large parties Theodore usually preferred. Emma was excited because intimate family time was rare, and she hoped that maybe in a smaller setting her father might finally warm to Daniel, might finally see him as something more than the disappointment who had married his daughter. She asked Daniel to please make an effort, to maybe dress up a bit and talk about his work in a way that might impress Theodore, and Daniel agreed while feeling dread settle over him like a heavy blanket. In the days leading up to the dinner, Daniel found himself thinking obsessively about the situation he had created. For years he had maintained this double life, this split between the person everyone thought he was, and the person he actually was. And the gap between those two identities had grown into a chasm so wide he no longer knew how to bridge it. He thought about simply telling Emma before the dinner, preparing her, but he could not find the right words or the right moment. He thought about canceling, claiming illness, but that would only postpone the inevitable and hurt Emma, who genuinely hoped for reconciliation with her father. He thought about so many possible scenarios, but none of them offered an escape route that did not involve destruction of some kind. Then, an idea began forming in Daniel's mind, dark and manipulative, but also strangely compelling. What if he went to this dinner and played his role perfectly? Played the poor struggling son-in-law that Theodore believed him to be, and simply observed what happened? What if he tested Theodore's character, tested whether this man who controlled his daughter's love and whose respect Emma desperately craved was capable of basic human decency? Daniel had built his entire fortune on information advantage, on understanding people's true motivations beneath their public presentations. Why not apply that same analytical lens to his father-in-law, finally get a clear picture of exactly who Theodore Harrison really was when he thought he had all the power? It was manipulative, undoubtedly, playing a role to expose someone else's character. But Daniel told himself it was justified, that he needed to know the truth about the man whose company he controlled and whose daughter he loved. The night of the dinner arrived with the weight of inevitability. Emma dressed in a simple but elegant dress, did her makeup carefully, and kept adjusting Daniel's tie because she wanted everything to be perfect. Daniel wore his one good suit, the same one he had been wearing to important occasions for years, properly maintained, but clearly not expensive. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man who appeared exactly as Theodore expected him to appear, moderately successful, but nothing special, certainly not wealthy, certainly not powerful, just an ordinary person who happened to have married extraordinarily well. The reflection staring back at him was both true and false, both honest and the most elaborate lie. And Daniel wondered not, for the first time, whether he had lost himself completely in this performance that had been running for so many years. They arrived at the Harrison mansion exactly on time because Daniel knew that Theodore valued punctuality and interpreted lateness as disrespect. Patricia opened the door with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, the same faded warmth Daniel had seen at every encounter, and she welcomed them inside with generic pleasantries about how nice it was to see them. The house was decorated for the birthday celebration, with elegant flower arrangements and fine china set at the dining room table, everything coordinated and perfect and somehow utterly without personality or warmth. Theodore appeared from his study wearing an expensive suit and an expression that made clear he considered this dinner an obligation rather than a pleasure. He shook Daniel's hand with a grip designed to be slightly too firm, a small dominance display that Daniel recognized and ignored. Dinner began with the kind of stilted conversation that characterized all their family gatherings, Patricia asking safe questions about Emma's work and Theodore periodically inserting comments about business conditions or political developments without inviting actual dialogue. Daniel played his part perfectly, speaking only when addressed, offering bland, agreeable responses, displaying the kind of careful deference that people without power show to people with it. Emma tried valiantly to create some warmth, talking about a recent vacation she and Daniel had taken to a state park, camping and hiking, simple pleasures that cost almost nothing. Theodore's face twisted with something that might have been disgust or pity when he heard they had stayed in a tent rather than a proper hotel, and he made a comment about how different people had different standards of comfort. As dinner progressed through its courses, Daniel felt the familiar anger building inside him, the same anger he had felt as a child when teachers dismissed him because of his address or store clerks followed him assuming he was shoplifting. Theodore's condescension was not loud or obvious, was delivered in the kind of subtle ways that allowed plausible deniability, but it was absolutely present in every glance and tone. He asked Daniel questions about his financial consulting business with a skepticism that suggested he believed Daniel was lying about his work entirely. He made comparisons between Emma's childhood and the modest life she now lived, sighing about all the things she had given up, implying that Daniel had dragged her down from her proper place. Patricia said nothing, just kept refilling wine glasses and offering more food as though activity could fill the void where genuine connection should have been. Then, as they finished the main course, and Patricia brought out the birthday cake, Theodore did something that would change everything. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the polished mahogany table directly in front of Daniel with a gesture so deliberate it could not be mistaken as casual. The envelope was thick, clearly containing significant content, and when Daniel looked at Theodore, he saw an expression that made his blood run cold. It was contempt mixed with satisfaction, the look of someone about to reveal their true nature, about to dispense with pretense, and say the cruel quiet part out loud. Emma looked confused, glancing between her father and the envelope, asking what this was about. Theodore ignored her, keeping his eyes locked on Daniel, and told him to open it. Chapter 7. Daniel's hands remained steady as he reached for the envelope, though his mind raced through 1,000 possibilities about what it might contain. Some part of him wondered if Theodore had somehow discovered his identity, if this was the moment when all his secrets exploded into the open, but that seemed impossibly unlikely given how carefully he had buried every connection. Emma was asking her father again what this was, her voice rising with concern, but Theodore just smiled. That cruel smile, and told Daniel to go ahead, see what was inside, called it a birthday gift to himself. Daniel broke the seal on the envelope and pulled out its contents, finding first a check made out to him, personally, for $500,000, and beneath that a legal document several pages long. His eyes scanned the document quickly, his years of analyzing complex business agreements allowing him to parse the legal language efficiently. It was a contract, a separation agreement, offering Daniel $500,000 to divorce Emma and disappear from her life permanently. The terms were brutal in their clarity, requiring Daniel to sign away all rights to any future contact with Emma, to move at least 500 miles away, to never publicly discuss the marriage or the Harrison family, to essentially erase himself from their lives, as though he had never existed. Failure to comply with any term would require him to return the money plus penalties and interest. The document was professionally prepared, clearly drafted by expensive lawyers, every contingency considered, every loophole closed. Daniel felt a strange calm settle over him, the same calm he experienced when analyzing companies and making investment decisions, a coldness that allowed him to think clearly even as rage burned underneath. He looked up from the document to find Theodore watching him with undisguised satisfaction, clearly expecting shock or anger or perhaps grateful acceptance. Emma had gone very still beside him, her face pale, and when she reached for the document, Daniel handed it to her without a word. She read it with growing horror, her hands beginning to shake, and when she finished, she turned to her father with an expression Daniel had never seen her wear before, something that combined hurt and fury and complete betrayal. Before Emma could speak, Theodore launched into a speech he had clearly prepared, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a stubborn child. He said that he had tried to be patient, had tried to hope that this marriage would run its natural course and end on its own, but it had become clear that Daniel was determined to cling to the lifestyle Emma provided regardless of how obviously inappropriate the match was. He said the $500,000 was more money than Daniel would see in 10 lifetimes of his current career trajectory, that it was a generous offer that would set him up comfortably and allow him to start over somewhere else with someone more suitable to his actual station. He said that Emma deserved a partner who could provide for her properly, someone from their world who understood their values and expectations, someone with the right family background and connections. Theodore said all of this while looking at Daniel with a confidence that assumed complete victory, assumed that money would do what social pressure had failed to do, assumed that every person had a price and $500,000 would certainly be enough for someone like Daniel. He said that Emma would understand eventually, that she would thank him for saving her from a mistake made out of youthful rebellion and misguided idealism. He said that they could have the marriage annulled quietly, that their social circle need not know the details, that everyone could move forward with their dignity intact. As Theodore spoke, Patricia stared at her plate saying nothing, complicit in her silence, and Daniel understood that she had known about this plan, had allowed her husband to prepare this cruelty. Emma found her voice then, and when she spoke it came out as a kind of controlled scream, fury barely contained beneath a thin veneer of civilized speech. She told her father that he was absolutely out of his mind if he thought she would agree to this, that she loved Daniel and had chosen him freely, that his money and his opinions meant nothing compared to the life she had built with the man she married. She told Theodore that he was cruel and controlling and that his obsession with status had turned him into someone she barely recognized as her father. She stood up from the table, chair scraping against the floor, and grabbed Daniel's hand, telling him they were leaving immediately. Daniel rose with her, still calm, still cold. And that was when he made the decision. That would detonate his secret like a nuclear bomb in the center of their lives. Instead of leaving, Daniel gently squeezed Emma's hand and asked her to wait for just one moment. He turned to Theodore with a smile that did not reach his eyes, and asked if Theodore knew who his largest shareholder was, who held 15% of Harrison Industries, and wielded more voting power than anyone else, including Theodore himself. Theodore looked confused by the non sequitur, irritated that Daniel was not simply accepting the money or arguing or doing anything that fit the script Theodore had written in his mind. He said of course he knew there was a large anonymous investor, that it was some investment firm with a deliberately generic name, that they had been mostly supportive, but their anonymity was irritating, and their influence was a constant frustration. He said this as though Daniel was an idiot for asking, as though everyone knew this information, as though it had no relevance to the current conversation. Daniel's smile widened and turned into something sharper, something with edges that could cut. He said that the anonymous investor Theodore was referring to, the one who had saved Theodore's position during the crisis 2 years ago, the one who had voted for every major strategic initiative, the one who controlled $10 billion worth of Harrison Industries stock, was sitting right here at this dinner table. Theodore's face went blank, confusion replacing contempt, and he said he did not understand what Daniel was implying. Emma looked at Daniel with equal confusion, asking what he was talking about. Daniel reached into his own jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, pulling up the financial application that tracked his investment portfolio, the numbers that he looked at every single day but never showed to anyone. He turned the phone around so both Theodore and Emma could see the screen showing the current value of his Harrison Industries holdings, the number that started with a 1 and had 10 digits following it, the shares held through the investment vehicle that Theodore had cursed and relied upon in equal measure without ever knowing who controlled it. He showed them the historical records of his votes on major board decisions, the pattern that would be immediately recognizable to Theodore as the anonymous investors. He showed them documentation that proved beyond any possible doubt that Daniel Morgan, the poor struggling son-in-law that Theodore had just offered $500,000 to disappear, was in fact the single most powerful shareholder in Theodore's company and one of the wealthiest men in the entire country. The silence that followed this revelation was so complete that Daniel could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, could hear Patricia's sharp intake of breath, could hear the wine glass that Theodore had been holding hit the table as his hand went slack. Emma was staring at the phone screen as though it showed something impossible, something her brain could not quite process, her mouth slightly open and her eyes wide. Theodore's face had gone from blank to red, blood vessels standing out on his forehead as his blood pressure spiked, and he looked like a man who had just seen his entire understanding of reality collapse, like a house built on sand. Chapter 8. Theodore's voice when he finally found it was hoarse and strangled, asking if this was some kind of joke, demanding to know what kind of fraud Daniel was trying to perpetrate. Daniel responded calmly that it was no joke and no fraud, that every document Theodore was looking at was completely genuine, and that if he wanted additional verification, Daniel could provide contact information for the legal team that managed his investments, and they could confirm every detail. He said that he had been accumulating shares in Harrison Industries since before he met Emma, that their relationship had nothing to do with his investment strategy, and that he had maintained his anonymity for the same reason most major investors preferred privacy, because it allowed cleaner decision-making without personal conflicts complicating business judgments. Emma's voice cut through the room like a knife, asking Daniel if this was real, if he had really been secretly wealthy this entire time they had been together, if everything about their life had been a lie. The hurt in her voice was so raw that it physically pained Daniel to hear it, and he turned to her trying to explain. He said that the money was real, but their relationship was not built on lies, that he had fallen in love with her genuinely and completely, that every moment they had shared together was authentic. He tried to explain that he had maintained his simple lifestyle long before meeting her, that it was not a performance for her benefit but how he actually chose to live, that wealth had never changed who he was fundamentally. He said he had wanted to tell her so many times, but the longer he waited the harder it became. Until the secret felt like a wall he did not know how to climb over or tear down. Emma was crying now, tears streaming down her face, and she asked him how he could hide something so fundamental, how he could watch her worry about money and make budgets and try to save for their future when he was secretly a billionaire. Daniel felt guilt crash over him in waves because she was right, because even though they had never struggled, even though he had always made sure they were comfortable, he had let her live with concerns that were completely unnecessary. He tried to explain that he never wanted money to define their relationship, that he had seen how wealth corrupted people and destroyed genuine connections, that he wanted her to love him for himself, rather than what he could provide materially. Even as he said the words they sounded like excuses, justifications for what was ultimately a betrayal of trust. Theodore had recovered some of his composure, his businessman's instincts taking over from his personal shock, and he asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. He asked if Daniel had pursued Emma deliberately, if their entire relationship had been engineered to gain some kind of leverage or control over Harrison Industries. Daniel met his eyes steadily and said absolutely not, that he had no idea who Emma was when they met in that coffee shop, that learning her last name weeks into their relationship had been as shocking to him as this revelation was to them now. He said that he had invested in Harrison Industries based purely on business fundamentals and growth potential, that the company was undervalued and well-positioned, and those were the only factors that mattered in his decision. He said that falling in love with Emma was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and also the most complicating factor in his life, because it created exactly the kind of conflict between personal and business interests that he had always tried to avoid. Patricia spoke for the first time since the revelation, her voice small and confused, asking why someone with $10 billion would live in a small apartment and drive an old car and live like they were barely middle class. Daniel turned to her and tried to explain something that he knew people who had never been poor could never fully understand. He said that growing up with nothing had taught him that material possessions did not create happiness or security, that the people with the biggest houses and fanciest cars often had the emptiest lives. He said that he had watched his mother work herself nearly to death trying to afford basic necessities, and he never wanted to become the kind of person who confused luxury with necessity, or who used wealth as a weapon to hurt others. He said that his simple lifestyle was not deprivation but liberation, freedom from the endless cycle of consumption and status competition that trapped so many wealthy people in lives they did not even enjoy. Theodore's mind was working through implications and calculations. Daniel could see it in his eyes, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted from shock to something more calculating. He said that if Daniel truly controlled 15% of Harrison Industries, they needed to discuss the future direction of the company, that there were opportunities and strategies that Theodore had been unable to pursue because of shareholder concerns. He was already trying to turn the situation to his advantage already, thinking about how to use this new information for his benefit. Daniel felt disgust rise in his throat, because this was exactly what he had feared, exactly why he had maintained his anonymity, because revealing his identity would immediately complicate every interaction with layers of self-interest and manipulation. Emma stood up abruptly, pushing her chair back so hard it tipped over and crashed to the floor. She said she could not be there anymore, could not listen to her father try to turn her husband's secret wealth into a business opportunity, could not process everything she was learning about the man she married and the father she had known her whole life. She said she needed air, needed space, needed time to think about all of this. She walked toward the door and then paused, looking back at Daniel with eyes that held a mixture of love and betrayal and confusion so profound it seemed to fragment her entirely. She asked him if there were other secrets, other fundamental truths about his life that he had never shared. Whether she actually knew him at all or had been living with a stranger wearing a familiar face. Daniel had no answer that would satisfy her because the truth was he did not know himself, did not know where his authentic self ended, and his protective performance began, did not know if it was possible to separate the two after so many years of blending them together. Emma did not wait for an answer, just walked out of the dining room, through the foyer, out the front door into the night. Daniel started to follow her, but Theodore's voice stopped him, sharp and commanding, saying they were not finished talking. Daniel turned back to his father-in-law, and spoke with a coldness that would have shocked everyone who knew him as mild-mannered and accommodating. He said that they were absolutely finished for tonight, that Theodore could take his separation agreement and $500,000 bribe, and use it as kindling, that Theodore had just tried to buy off a man worth $10 billion with money that was essentially pocket change. Daniel said that Theodore had revealed exactly who he was tonight. Someone who valued control and status over his own daughter's happiness, someone whose first instinct upon learning his son-in-law was wealthy was to calculate advantage rather than apologize for years of contempt and disrespect. He said that Theodore was everything Daniel had feared wealthy people were when he was growing up poor, the kind of person who measured human worth entirely in dollars and treated anyone with less money as inherently inferior. He said that he had voted to keep Theodore as CEO out of business judgment, but that if Theodore's personal behavior continued to hurt Emma, Daniel would not hesitate to use his influence to make changes at the board level. The threat hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, a complete reversal of the power dynamic that had defined their entire relationship. Theodore's face went red again, rage warring with fear because he understood that his position was suddenly far more precarious than he had ever imagined. Daniel did not wait for a response, just turned and followed Emma out into the night, leaving Theodore and Patricia sitting at their elegant dining table surrounded by birthday cake and documents that had become meaningless, their carefully constructed evening reduced to rubble by truths that could not be taken back or ignored. Chapter 9. Daniel found Emma sitting in their car in the Harrison Mansion's circular driveway, her face illuminated by the dashboard lights and wet with tears. He got into the passenger seat quietly, saying nothing at first, just sitting with her in the silence that felt heavy with everything unsaid over the years. Emma did not look at him, just stared straight ahead through the windshield at the mansion where she had grown up, where she had learned that love was conditional, and performance was expected, and disappointment was met with coldness rather than understanding. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and broken in a way that made Daniel's chest physically ache. She said she did not know what to feel, did not know whether to be angry at him for lying or relieved, that they did not have to worry about money or hurt that he did not trust her with the truth. She said she had spent 3.5 years thinking she knew him completely, thinking they had built a life together based on honesty and shared values, and now she was discovering that huge parts of his identity had been hidden from her all along. She asked him to explain from the beginning, to tell her the whole story of how a poor kid from a rough neighborhood became a billionaire, and then decided to hide that fact from everyone, including the woman he married. She said she deserved the complete truth, not the carefully edited version he had been feeding her, but everything, including the parts that made him look bad, or that he was ashamed of. So Daniel told her. He told her about counting pennies as a child, and his mother's exhaustion, and his father's abandonment. He told her about discovering the stock market in a discarded newspaper, and teaching himself to invest with a desperation that came from knowing poverty could kill just as surely as violence. He told her about his first investment, and how it grew, and how he developed a strategy of finding undervalued companies and holding them patiently until the market recognized their true worth. He told her about Harrison Industries, how he had identified it as exactly the kind of company he wanted to invest in. Years before he met her, how he had steadily accumulated shares through anonymous vehicles to maintain his privacy. He told her about the coffee shop, about seeing her and being drawn to her kindness, about learning her last name and realizing the impossible complication it created. He told her about all the times he had almost revealed the truth, all the moments when the words gathered in his throat, only to be swallowed back down by fear. Fear that she would think he had manipulated her, fear that revealing his wealth would change their relationship, fear that she would question whether his love was real or strategic. He told her that maintaining the secret had become harder every day, that watching her father treat him with contempt, while knowing he controlled Theodore's company, had been both satisfying and torturous. He told her that his simple lifestyle was not an act for her benefit, but genuinely how he preferred to live, that the money in his accounts was about security and power rather than consumption. He told her that loving her was the truest and best thing in his life, and that he was terribly sorry he had hidden something so fundamental, that he had no good excuse except fear and shame, and not knowing how to fix something that had gotten too big to easily correct. Emma listened to all of this without interrupting, tears still sliding down her face. And when he finished, she sat in silence for a long time, processing everything. Then she asked the question that Daniel had been dreading, the question that cut to the heart of whether their marriage could survive this revelation. She asked if their entire life together had been a performance on his part, if the man she thought she knew even existed, or if it was all carefully constructed theater designed to hide his real identity. Daniel reached for her hand and she let him take it, which felt like the smallest hint of hope. He said that his core self had always been genuine, that his values and beliefs and the way he treated people were not performances, but reflections of who he actually was. He said that the performance was only in hiding the money, in maintaining the appearance of moderate success rather than extreme wealth, but that everything else, his love for her and his kindness and his interests and his personality, were completely real. He told her that he understood if she needed time to process this, if she needed space to figure out how she felt about everything, but that he wanted her to know his love was absolutely authentic, and had been from the very first moment. Emma looked at him finally, really looked at him, searching his face for signs of deception or manipulation, and Daniel let her look, hiding nothing, letting her see all the fear and hope and desperate love that churned inside him. She said she believed that he loved her, that she could see the truth of that in his eyes, but that belief did not make the betrayal hurt less, or erase the fact that he had made a choice every day for years to keep lying to her by omission. She said she needed time to think, needed to sort through her feelings, without him there trying to explain or justify or manage her reactions. She asked him to stay somewhere else for a while, maybe a week or two, while she figured out what she wanted their marriage to look like going forward. Daniel's heart sank, but he understood. Knew he had no right to demand anything after keeping such a massive secret for so long. He agreed to give her space, said he would get a hotel room and she could contact him whenever she was ready to talk. He asked if there was anything he could do, anything she needed from him. And Emma said the only thing she needed was the truth from now on, complete truth without editing or strategic omissions, because if they were going to rebuild trust, she needed to know he was capable of being fully honest, even when it was uncomfortable or risky. Daniel moved out that night, throwing some clothes in a bag from their apartment while Emma sat silently on the couch not looking at him. He went to a decent hotel, not ostentatious but comfortable, and checked in under his real name for the first time in his life without worrying about maintaining his cover. The secret was out now, at least with the people who mattered most, and there was strange relief in that, even though the revelation had potentially destroyed his marriage. He lay on the hotel bed staring at the ceiling, and feeling the weight that had pressed on him for 7 years finally lift, replaced by a different weight, the weight of consequences and uncertainty about the future. Over the next several days, Daniel's life experienced an earthquake whose aftershocks would reshape everything. Word began to spread through business circles that the mysterious anonymous investor in Harrison Industries had been revealed, that Daniel Morgan was not a struggling consultant but a billionaire who had been hiding in plain sight. Financial journalists started investigating his story, trying to piece together how he had accumulated such wealth so young, and why he had chosen anonymity. Requests for interviews flooded his email and phone, venture capitalists and investment firms reaching out with opportunities, charities asking for donations. Suddenly, everyone wanted access to Daniel Morgan now that his net worth was public knowledge. The attention was overwhelming and invasive. Exactly what Daniel had spent years trying to avoid, confirmation that his fears about revelation had been well-founded. Chapter 10. While Daniel dealt with the sudden exposure of his secret identity, Theodore Harrison was experiencing his own reckoning with consequences he had never imagined possible. The morning after the disastrous birthday dinner, Theodore arrived at his office to find an email from Daniel's legal team requesting an emergency board meeting to discuss governance and leadership issues at Harrison Industries. The email was formally polite, but the implied threat was clear, and Theodore understood that his attempt to buy off his son-in-law had spectacularly backfired in ways that now threatened his control of the company he had built. He spent the morning making frantic calls to board members he considered allies, trying to shore up support, but the conversations did not go as he expected. Several board members expressed surprise that Theodore had allowed his relationship with his largest shareholder to deteriorate so badly, suggesting that personal conflicts had created business liabilities. The board meeting took place 3 days later in the Harrison Industries conference room, and Daniel attended in person for the first time rather than voting through proxies. His appearance shocked the assembled executives and board members who had only known him as a name on shareholder documents, and Theodore watched with barely concealed fury as people who had never given his son-in-law a second thought now treated Daniel with the deference and respect that money commanded in their world. Daniel presented a detailed analysis of Harrison Industries' strategic position and proposed several initiatives designed to strengthen the company's competitive advantages and accelerate growth. His proposals were sophisticated and well-reasoned, demonstrating business acumen that made several board members nod in appreciation. Then Daniel addressed the elephant in the room with a directness that left no ambiguity about his intentions. He said that as the company's largest shareholder, he had an obligation to ensure that leadership served all stakeholders' interests, rather than personal ego or family dynasty. He said that Theodore Harrison had built an impressive company over 3 decades, but that recent events had raised questions about whether personal judgment might be affecting professional decisions. He did not explicitly mention the separation agreement or the attempted bribe, did not need to because several board members had already heard rumors about what happened at the birthday dinner. Daniel said he was not calling for Theodore's immediate removal, but was putting on record that continued support for current leadership was contingent on demonstrated commitment to shareholder value over personal interests. The message could not have been clearer. Theodore was on notice, his position dependent on Daniel's continued goodwill, and everyone in that conference room understood the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Theodore tried to respond, tried to defend himself and reassert his authority, but his words came out defensive and weak. He had spent years being the most powerful person in every room, having the final say on every decision, and suddenly, he was discovering what it felt like to be on the other side of that dynamic. The board meeting ended with Theodore technically still in position as CEO but practically diminished, his authority conditional rather than absolute, and he left the conference room looking older and smaller than when he had entered. Patricia called Daniel that evening, her voice shaking, begging him not to destroy her husband out of revenge for how Theodore had treated him. Daniel responded more gently than she probably deserved given her complicity in Theodore's cruelty, explaining that he had no interest in revenge, but would not allow personal animosity to interfere with his responsibility to all shareholders. He said that if Theodore could lead the company effectively while treating his family with basic decency, Daniel would support him completely. But if Theodore continued to prioritize control over performance or allowed personal conflicts to create business problems, Daniel would exercise his rights as majority shareholder to make necessary changes. He told Patricia that the choice was entirely Theodore's, that he was offering a path forward if Theodore was willing to take it, but that path required fundamental changes in behavior and attitude. Meanwhile, Emma was experiencing her own complicated reactions to the revelation of Daniel's wealth and the confrontation with her father. Friends and family members reached out after learning about the situation through various channels, and Emma found herself having to explain things she was still processing herself. Some people congratulated her on having married so well, as though Daniel's money was the accomplishment rather than the relationship they had built, and those comments made her angry in ways she struggled to articulate. She had not married Daniel for his money, had loved him believing he had none, and the suggestion that wealth made the marriage more valuable felt like an insult to everything they had shared. Other people suggested Daniel had manipulated her, had hidden his wealth for nefarious reasons, and those comments made her defensive even though she was still hurt by his deception. Emma spent hours thinking about their relationship, reviewing memories and conversations, and trying to separate what had been real from what had been performance. She thought about all the times Daniel had volunteered at the educational nonprofit, working with low-income students with a passion that seemed completely genuine. She thought about how he treated service workers and strangers with kindness that never felt calculated or strategic. She thought about quiet evenings at home, conversations that ranged from silly to profound. The way he made her laugh and listened when she needed to vent about work frustrations. Those moments felt authentic, felt like a man revealing his true self rather than maintaining a facade, and gradually, Emma began to understand that Daniel hiding his wealth did not mean he had been hiding his character. But she was still angry, still hurt, still struggling with the fact that her husband had made a choice every single day for years to keep a massive secret. She understood his reasoning intellectually, could even sympathize with his fear that revealing his wealth would change how people treated him, but understanding did not erase the pain of betrayal. She had trusted him completely, had built a life with him based on what she thought was radical honesty and mutual vulnerability, and discovering that such a fundamental truth had been hidden made her question everything else. How could she trust him going forward when he had proven capable of maintaining an elaborate lie for years? What other secrets might he be keeping? The questions spiraled through her mind without easy answers. After 10 days of separation, Emma called Daniel and asked him to meet her at the coffee shop where they had first encountered each other all those years ago. Daniel arrived early and waited anxiously, drinking terrible coffee and watching the door with a combination of hope and dread. When Emma walked in, she looked tired and sad, but also somehow more centered than when he had last seen her, as though she had worked through something difficult and come out the other side. They sat at the same table where they had met, the coincidence feeling heavy with symbolism neither of them commented on, and Emma told Daniel what she had decided. She said that she still loved him, that going through their history and thinking about who he really was had only confirmed that the man she fell in love with was genuine, even if parts of his life were hidden. She said she believed his explanation that the secrecy was about fear rather than manipulation, and she could understand that fear, even if she did not agree with how he had handled it. But she said that for their marriage to continue, things had to change fundamentally. No more secrets, no more strategic omissions, no more managing her perception of reality to protect himself or avoid difficult conversations. She said she needed complete transparency going forward about everything, his finances, and his business dealings, and any decisions that might affect their lives together. She needed to be a true partner, not someone protected from information Daniel deemed too complicated or risky to share. Daniel agreed immediately and completely, relief flooding through him so intensely he felt dizzy with it. He promised that there would be no more secrets, that he would tell her everything about his business and investments and financial situation, that he would include her in all major decisions going forward. He said he would set up meetings with his lawyers and accountants so she could understand the full scope of his holdings and have input on how they managed their wealth. He said that if she wanted them to change their lifestyle, to move to a nicer place or do any of the things that wealthy people typically did, he would be open to that conversation. Emma smiled slightly and said she liked their apartment and their simple life, that his money did not change what made her happy, but that knowing about it and having a say in how it was used mattered tremendously. They talked for hours that afternoon, working through details and feelings and plans for rebuilding trust. Emma told him about her conversations with her parents, how her mother had called crying and apologizing, how her father had sent a stiff formal email that was probably the closest Theodore Harrison would ever come to admitting he was wrong. She said she had told her father that Daniel's wealth did not vindicate Theodore's cruelty, that treating people badly because you thought they were poor revealed character flaws that Theodore needed to address regardless of anyone's net worth. She said she had made clear to both parents that her marriage was her choice and her priority, and that their relationship going forward would depend on them treating Daniel with respect, rather than contempt, based on false assumptions about his status. Daniel told her about the board meeting and his confrontation with Theodore, about the sudden unwanted attention from business media and investors and everyone else who wanted access to his money. He told her he was thinking about going public with his story on his own terms, doing a single comprehensive interview that would satisfy curiosity and hopefully let him return to privacy afterward. Emma thought that was smart, taking control of the narrative rather than letting others define him through speculation and incomplete information. She offered to be there for the interview if he wanted, to show that their marriage had survived. The revelation, and Daniel accepted gratefully because her presence would mean everything. They left the coffee shop together that afternoon, walking back to their apartment hand in hand, and even though there were still difficult conversations ahead and trust to rebuild, both of them felt like they had turned a corner. The secret that had defined Daniel's life for so long was finally out, in the open, and while the revelation had been painful and messy, it had also created the possibility of real intimacy in ways that were impossible. When Daniel was constantly guarding such a fundamental truth, Emma moved back into their apartment that night, and they began the slow work of rebuilding their marriage on a foundation of complete honesty rather than strategic omissions. Chapter 11. In the weeks following their reconciliation, Daniel and Emma began having conversations they had never been able to have before, conversations about what they wanted their life to look like now that the truth was no longer hidden. Daniel arranged for Emma to meet with his financial advisors and lawyers, walking her through his entire portfolio and the structures he had created to manage his wealth anonymously. Emma was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it, the complexity of the holdings and investments that Daniel had been managing alone for years. She understood why he had kept it secret in a new way when she saw how time-consuming and intricate the management was, how it was essentially a full-time job disguised as freelance consulting work. They discussed whether to change their lifestyle significantly, and Emma surprised Daniel by saying she wanted to keep things mostly the same. She liked their apartment, liked the neighborhood, liked the rhythm of their daily life. The money was abstractly comforting, knowing they would never struggle and could handle any emergency, but she did not want the kind of wealthy lifestyle her parents lived, the constant performance and status competition and emptiness dressed up as sophistication. Daniel felt immense relief at her words because they confirmed that his instinct about who Emma was had been correct, that she truly did not care about material displays of wealth, that her values aligned with his in ways that transcended money. But they did make some changes, particularly in how they used Daniel's wealth to make a difference in areas they both cared about. Emma had always been passionate about educational equity, and now they could fund programs and scholarships at a level that would meaningfully change lives. They established a foundation focused on helping low-income students access higher education, providing not just tuition assistance but comprehensive support including mentoring, job connections, and emergency funds for unexpected expenses that often derailed promising students. Daniel threw himself into this philanthropic work with the same intensity he had brought to building his fortune, researching best practices and measuring outcomes and ensuring every dollar was used effectively. They also set up a trust for Daniel's mother, ensuring that Maria Morgan would never have to worry about money again. Daniel went to visit her and told her the truth about his wealth, watching her face cycle through shock and disbelief, and finally tears as she understood that her son had accomplished everything he had promised when he was a child studying stock prices by flashlight under his blankets. She did not want his money, insisted she was fine, but Daniel explained gently that he needed her to be secure, that knowing she was cared for allowed him to breathe freely in ways he had not been able to when she was still working and struggling. Maria finally accepted, and Daniel bought her a modest, comfortable house in a safe neighborhood and made sure she had everything she needed for a peaceful retirement. The media attention around Daniel's story was intense, but brief, as he had hoped. He did one comprehensive interview with a respected business journalist, telling his story from childhood, poverty through education and early investments to building his fortune while maintaining strict anonymity. The article, when it came out, portrayed him sympathetically as someone who had beaten odds and refused to let wealth corrupt his character, and while there were plenty of critics who suggested his secrecy was problematic or that hiding wealth from his wife was unforgivable, the general response was positive. Then, as media attention does, it moved on to other stories, other revelations, and Daniel was able to return to relative obscurity, though he would never again be as anonymous as he had been before. Theodore Harrison's response to the changed power dynamic was grudging and slow, but it did eventually come. He had spent weeks after the disastrous birthday dinner alternating between rage and fear, angry that his attempt to buy off Daniel had backfired so spectacularly and afraid that Daniel would use his power to destroy everything Theodore had built. But as weeks passed and Daniel took no hostile action beyond the warning delivered at the board meeting, Theodore began to understand that Daniel genuinely had no interest in revenge, that the threat was real but contingent on Theodore's behavior going forward. Pride made it difficult for Theodore to change. Decades of being the most powerful person in every room made deference feel like humiliation, but survival instinct eventually overrode pride. Theodore called Daniel and asked to meet, just the two of them, over lunch at a quiet restaurant where they could talk privately. Daniel agreed, curious about what Theodore wanted and prepared for anything from an attack to an apology. What he got was something in between, a conversation where Theodore tried to justify his actions while also acknowledging that he had misjudged Daniel spectacularly. Theodore said he had only wanted to protect his daughter, that he had seen what he thought was a poor young man taking advantage of Emma's kind nature, and his instinct had been to intervene before real damage was done. He said the separation agreement had been meant as a test to see if Daniel could be bought off, and he had clearly gotten that test catastrophically wrong. Daniel listened without interrupting, letting Theodore work through his defensive explanations, and then responded with a directness that left no room for misunderstanding. He said that Theodore's claimed protective instinct was really just classism, prejudice against people who came from poverty, an assumption that wealth equaled worth and lack of wealth equaled inferiority. He said that Theodore had treated him with contempt for years, based entirely on superficial markers, never bothering to get to know him as a person or give him credit for making Emma genuinely happy. He said that the fact that revealing his wealth had changed Theodore's attitude only proved that Theodore's respect was shallow and conditional, based on net worth rather than character. He said all of this calmly but firmly, not trying to hurt Theodore, but not softening truths that needed to be said. Theodore's face went red as he listened, clearly struggling with anger and shame in equal measure, but to his credit he did not explode or walk out. He sat with the criticism, forced himself to hear it, and finally admitted in a voice that sounded like the words cost him dearly that Daniel was right. He said he had spent so long in circles where money was the only thing that mattered that he had forgotten how to evaluate people on any other basis. He said his own journey from modest beginnings to wealth had made him defensive about status, desperate to prove himself to people who had looked down on him, and somewhere along the way he had become the very people who had once dismissed him. The admission was not quite an apology, but it was closer than Daniel had expected, and he decided it was enough for a starting point. They talked for another hour about Harrison Industries, about strategic direction, and opportunities and challenges ahead. And it was the first time they had ever communicated as equals rather than as adversaries in a class-based hierarchy. Daniel shared some of his thinking about emerging markets and technology, investments that might benefit the company, and Theodore responded with insights from his decades of operational experience, and the conversation was actually productive in ways that surprised both of them. They did not become friends, the history was too fraught, and the wounds too fresh for that, but they established a working relationship based on mutual interest in the company's success, and that was significant progress. Emma's relationship with her father also slowly began to heal, though it would never be the same as before. She had seen Theodore's true character revealed in that birthday dinner, had watched him try to buy off the man she loved as though human relationships were just another business transaction, and she could not unsee that cruelty. But Theodore was still her father, and Emma was not the kind of person who cut off family without giving them chances to change. She set boundaries, made clear that her marriage came first and that Daniel would be treated with respect, or she would limit contact. But she remained open to rebuilding if Theodore could demonstrate genuine change rather than just strategic adjustment. Patricia reached out to Emma separately, apologizing for her silence during Theodore's attempted bribe, explaining that she had felt powerless to intervene. Emma listened but felt little sympathy, because she understood that Patricia's faded quality came from years of choosing to be powerless, of enabling Theodore's worst instincts rather than challenging them. Emma told her mother gently but firmly that being afraid of your spouse was not the same as being complicit with their cruelty, that silence was a choice, and that Patricia bore responsibility for not protecting her daughter from Theodore's manipulations. Patricia cried and apologized and promised to do better, and Emma accepted the apology while privately doubting much would change. Some patterns were too deeply established to break easily. Chapter 12. As months passed and life settled into new rhythms, Daniel discovered something unexpected about living without his central secret. He felt lighter, freer, more fully himself than he had in years. The constant vigilance required to maintain his cover story had been exhausting in ways he had not fully recognized, until it was gone, and removing that burden allowed him to engage with life more openly and honestly. He and Emma developed deeper intimacy as he shared more about his work and his thinking, as she offered perspectives that improved his decision-making, as they became true partners in ways that had been impossible when half his life was hidden. They did eventually move, not because their apartment was insufficient, but because they wanted space for the family they were planning to start. They bought a house in a middle-class neighborhood, comfortable but not ostentatious, with a good public school system and a backyard where children could play. The house cost less than 1% of Daniel's net worth, a fact that still made Emma shake her head in amazement when she thought about it, but it was perfect for their needs and reflected their values better than any mansion could. They furnished it thoughtfully with pieces they both loved, rather than with expensive designer items meant to impress visitors, and it became a home in ways that felt authentic and earned. Daniel continued his investment work, though he was more selective about new positions and focused increasingly on companies whose missions aligned with his values around sustainability and social responsibility. He discovered that having public identity as a successful investor opened doors that anonymity had kept closed, allowing him to mentor young people from backgrounds like his who were trying to break into finance, allowing him to speak publicly about the importance of social mobility and economic opportunity. He became, to his surprise, a voice in conversations about wealth inequality and capitalism's flaws, bringing perspectives from someone who had experienced both poverty and wealth, and could speak authentically about both. Emma thrived in her work at the educational nonprofit, and with Daniel's financial backing, they were able to expand programs significantly, helping hundreds of students access opportunities that would have been impossible otherwise. She found deep satisfaction in seeing the concrete results of their combined efforts: students who were first in their families to attend college, young people who started businesses or pursued creative careers because someone had believed in them and provided support. The work was endlessly challenging, but also endlessly rewarding, and Emma felt like they were building a legacy that mattered more than any amount of accumulated wealth. The foundation they created together became a major project for both of them, something they poured time and energy and resources into with shared passion. They hired talented staff who shared their vision, established clear metrics for success, and worked to build an organization that would outlive them and continue making a difference for generations. Daniel brought his analytical skills and business expertise. Emma brought her understanding of nonprofit operations and the actual needs of students they served, and together they created something genuinely impactful. It felt like the best possible use of wealth that Daniel had accumulated, turning money that could have been spent on yachts and mansions into futures changed and opportunities created. Harrison Industries continued to thrive under Theodore's leadership, aided by Daniel's strategic guidance and willingness to support long-term investments that other shareholders might have opposed. The company's value continued to grow, which meant Daniel's net worth kept increasing even though he was spending significant amounts on philanthropy. The mathematics of wealth at that scale were absurd, generating returns faster than he could possibly give money away, and Daniel sometimes felt frustrated by the impossibility of meaningfully diminishing his fortune. But he tried to focus on the impact rather than the numbers, on lives changed rather than dollars distributed, on building systems that would continue helping people long after his money was gone. 3 years after the revelation at the birthday dinner, Emma gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Maria after Daniel's mother. Holding his daughter for the first time, Daniel felt emotions so overwhelming he could barely breathe. A fierce protective love mixed with terror at the responsibility and hope for all the possibilities ahead. He thought about the child he had been, counting pennies and eating government cheese and studying by flashlight because his mother could not afford to leave lights on, and he thought about the childhood his daughter would have, born into security and opportunity and freedom from financial fear. The gulf between those two childhoods was almost too vast to comprehend, and Daniel promised himself he would do everything possible to ensure his daughter understood how fortunate she was without making her feel guilty about it. Raising their daughter, Daniel and Emma talked constantly about how to instill good values while providing material comfort. How to teach empathy and gratitude when you never experienced want. How to prepare a child to inherit wealth responsibly. They decided to keep their lifestyle modest despite their means, to emphasize experiences over possessions, to involve their daughter in their philanthropic work from a young age so she understood that wealth carried obligations to help others. They wanted her to grow up knowing her family's story, knowing that her grandfather Daniel had been poor and worked impossibly hard to build a better life, knowing that security was not something to take for granted, but something many people never experienced. Daniel's mother Maria, the grandmother her namesake was named for, became a constant presence in their lives, helping with child care and cooking meals and telling stories about Daniel's childhood that made Emma laugh and cry. Maria had softened in retirement, the hard edges worn away by finally having enough rest and security. And she was a wonderful grandmother, who spoiled little Maria with attention if not with things. Watching his mother play with his daughter, Daniel sometimes felt so grateful he thought his heart might burst, grateful that he had been able to change their circumstances, grateful that his mother had lived to see his success, grateful for every moment they had together. Theodore remained a complicated figure in their lives, never quite warm but no longer openly hostile, making efforts to build a relationship with his granddaughter, even if he struggled to admit he had been wrong about her father. Daniel watched Theodore with little Maria and saw glimpses of a different man, someone capable of tenderness even if he rarely allowed it to show, and Daniel chose to focus on those glimpses rather than nursing old resentments. Life was too short and too precious to waste on bitterness, and Emma's happiness mattered more than his pride. Chapter 13. As their daughter Maria grew from infant to toddler to precocious child, Daniel found himself thinking more about legacy and what he wanted to leave behind beyond money. He had accumulated wealth almost accidentally as a side effect of his analytical abilities and investment discipline, but wealth alone was not a legacy worth having. He wanted to build something that would outlast him. Systems and institutions that would continue creating opportunity long after he was gone, that would help children like he had been find paths out of poverty into lives of choice and possibility. The foundation expanded its reach, moving beyond just educational scholarships to funding comprehensive programs that addressed the interconnected challenges of poverty. They supported organizations working on affordable housing, childhood, nutrition, healthcare access, all the factors that determined whether a child born into poverty would get a fair chance to succeed or would be trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Daniel brought the same rigor to philanthropic evaluation that he had brought to investment analysis, measuring outcomes and adjusting strategies and refusing to fund programs that felt good but did not demonstrate real impact. Emma took the lead on many of the foundation's initiatives, traveling to meet with community organizations and students and families whose lives they touched. She told Daniel stories that broke his heart and renewed his commitment. Stories of brilliant kids whose potential was being wasted because they could not afford books, or lived in food deserts, or had to work full-time jobs to help their families while trying to attend school. Every story reminded Daniel of his own childhood, of how close he had come to being just another statistic of squandered potential, and reinforced his belief that talent was distributed equally, but opportunity was not. When Maria was 5 years old, they had a conversation that would shape how they thought about wealth and family going forward. She had noticed that some of her friends lived in bigger houses and had more toys, and she asked Emma why they lived in a regular house when Grandpa Theodore lived in a mansion. Emma explained carefully that they had enough money to live however they wanted, but they chose to live simply because things did not make people happy. Relationships and experiences did. She explained that they were very fortunate, and that with fortune came responsibility to help others who had less. Maria absorbed this with the seriousness of a child trying to understand adult concepts, and she asked if they were rich. Emma said yes, they were very rich. But that being rich was not something to brag about, or feel superior about. It was simply a fact that carried certain obligations. Daniel was proud of how Emma handled the conversation, how she presented their wealth as something neutral rather than shameful or celebrated. They wanted Maria to grow up with healthy attitudes about money, understanding it as a tool rather than a measure of worth, understanding that their family's fortune was partly luck and timing and not just hard work despite the meritocracy myths our culture promoted. They wanted her to know the story of Daniel's childhood without making her feel guilty about her own privilege, to understand that poverty was a systemic failure rather than individual moral failing, to develop empathy without the condescension that often characterized wealthy people's charitable efforts. As the years passed, Daniel took on a more Q&A role despite his natural preference for privacy, speaking at conferences and writing articles about conscious capitalism and the obligations of wealth. He argued that the system that had allowed him to accumulate billions was fundamentally broken, that no individual should be able to amass such disproportionate resources while others struggled to afford basic necessities. He advocated for higher taxes on the wealthy, stronger social safety nets, and policies that would make the kind of mobility he experienced more common rather than exceptional. These positions made him controversial in some business circles, where wealthy people typically opposed anything that might reduce their wealth, but Daniel did not care about being popular with other billionaires. He told an interviewer once that having experienced both poverty and wealth had taught him that the narrative society told about both was largely fiction. Poor people were not poor because they were lazy or made bad decisions, they were poor because wages were too low and costs were too high, and the system was designed to extract wealth upward. Rich people were not rich because they were necessarily smarter or worked harder, they were rich because they had access to capital and opportunities and safety nets that allowed them to take risks without facing catastrophic consequences if those risks failed. His own story, he said, was 1% hard work and 99% fortunate timing and circumstances beyond his control, and anyone who claimed otherwise was either lying or delusional. These views made Daniel an unusual figure in the world of high finance, someone who had succeeded within capitalism's rules but remained deeply critical of capitalism's outcomes. He used his wealth and platform to fund organizations working for systemic change, supporting everything from union organizing to housing justice to campaigns for universal basic income. He told Emma once that if he could successfully work himself out of billionaire status by giving away money faster than it accumulated, he would consider that the greatest achievement of his life. Emma laughed and kissed him, and told him she loved that he could become rich without becoming whatever Theodore was, that he had maintained his values even as his circumstances changed completely. Theodore himself was aging, health issues forcing him to consider succession planning at Harrison Industries, and he surprised everyone by asking Daniel for input on who should take over as CEO. They had worked together for nearly 8 years by this point, their relationship evolving into something that was not quite friendship but was mutual respect based on shared interest in the company's success. Daniel reviewed potential candidates with the same thoroughness he brought to all business analysis, ultimately recommending someone from outside the family and outside current leadership, someone with vision and integrity who would take the company in directions Theodore had been too conservative to pursue. Theodore listened to Daniel's reasoning, pushed back on some points, agreed with others, and ultimately followed Daniel's recommendation, which felt like acknowledgement of trust earned over years of demonstrated judgment. On the day Theodore officially retired, they had a private conversation in Theodore's office that neither Emma nor anyone else was present for. Theodore told Daniel that he had been wrong about him, that his prejudice, based on assumptions about poverty and class, had blinded him to Daniel's abilities and character, and that he regretted the years they had wasted on conflict that should never have happened. He said that Daniel had proven to be everything a father could want in a son-in-law, that he had made Emma happy and built something meaningful with his life, and that Theodore was genuinely proud to be connected to him even if he had done nothing to earn or deserve that connection. It was the closest Theodore would ever come to a real apology, and Daniel accepted it for what it was, a proud man acknowledging error in the only way his pride would allow. Chapter 14. By the time Daniel reached his 40th birthday, his life had settled into rhythms that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in the daily details, dropping Maria at school and having coffee With Emma and working from his home office analyzing companies and markets, extraordinary in the scope and impact, having built a philanthropic operation that touched thousands of lives annually, having shaped the direction of a major corporation through his investments, having demonstrated that wealth did not have to corrupt and success did not require abandoning values. He looked back at the child he had been, counting pennies by flashlight and dreaming of security, and he felt profound gratitude for every twist of luck and effort that had brought him here. The educational foundation he and Emma had built was now supporting over 5,000 students annually, providing not just financial aid but comprehensive support systems that address the complex barriers to educational achievement. Follow-up studies showed that their students graduated at rates comparable to wealthy students, and went on to careers and opportunities that would have been impossible without intervention. Each success story felt personal to Daniel. Each student who overcame odds reminded him of his own journey. And he pushed constantly to expand their reach and help more young people find paths to better futures. They hired many of their scholarship recipients into the foundation itself once they graduated, creating a virtuous circle where people who had received help paid forward by helping the next generation. These employees brought perspectives and insights that someone from a wealthy background could never provide. Understanding from lived experience what students needed and how to make programs more effective. Daniel stepped back increasingly from day-to-day operations, trusting the team they had built to carry forward the mission while he focused on strategic direction and funding. His investment portfolio had evolved too, becoming more focused on companies that aligned with his values around sustainability and social responsibility. He divested from industries he considered harmful, refusing to profit from tobacco, or private prisons, or predatory lending regardless of potential returns. He invested heavily in renewable energy and affordable housing development and healthcare innovation, trying to direct capital towards solving problems rather than extracting wealth from vulnerable populations. Returns were still strong because companies that treated workers well and operated ethically tended to build sustainable competitive advantages. But even if returns had been lower, Daniel would have maintained these positions because profit was no longer his only consideration. Maria was 11 now, thoughtful and curious and already showing signs of her father's analytical mind and her mother's emotional intelligence. They had raised her with awareness of their wealth but without the entitlement that often came with privilege, making her volunteer alongside them at the foundation and meet the students they supported. She asked questions that sometimes floored Daniel with their insight. Questions about why poverty existed if people like her dad could give away so much money, why the government did not do more to help everyone, why some kids had so much while others had so little. He answered as honestly as he could, trying to give her frameworks for understanding injustice without making her feel guilty about things that were not her fault. She knew her father's story, knew that Grandma Maria had worked multiple jobs and that her dad had grown up poor and studied incredibly hard to create opportunities for himself. She was proud of this narrative in ways that sometimes worried Daniel, because he did not want her to internalize the meritocracy myth that success came purely from hard work. He tried to balance the story, acknowledging his effort while also emphasizing the luck and privilege that had enabled that effort to translate into success. He told her about the talented kids he had known growing up who had worked just as hard but never got breaks, whose potential was wasted because they got sick at the wrong time or had family emergencies that derailed their education, or simply lived in communities where opportunity never arrived. Emma continued her work, but also found time for her own creative pursuits, taking up painting and producing work that was genuinely good, rather than just wealthy person hobbyism. She donated proceeds from occasional sales to organizations supporting arts education in low-income communities, believing firmly that creativity was not a luxury but essential to human flourishing. She and Daniel took regular vacations, traveling modestly but widely, showing Maria different cultures and ways of living. They stayed in mid-range hotels rather than luxury resorts, ate at local restaurants rather than expensive tourist traps, trying to travel in ways that felt respectful and educational rather than exploitative. Theodore's health continued declining, multiple conditions compounding into serious concerns, and Emma spent more time with her parents as Theodore faced his mortality. Daniel accompanied her on these visits, and he and Theodore had conversations that were surprisingly vulnerable given their difficult history. Theodore talked about regrets, about how his obsession with status and success had made him miss so much of Emma's childhood, how his coldness had driven Patricia into a kind of living withdrawal. He said he was proud of the company he had built, but wished he had spent less time building and more time living. Daniel listened and offered what comfort he could, recognizing in Theodore's regrets a warning about what happened when you let ambition consume everything else. When Theodore finally passed away after a prolonged illness, Daniel felt complicated grief for a man who had been his adversary, then his business partner, and finally something like a friend. The funeral was large and formal, filled with business associates and society figures who came to pay respects to a prominent man, but the private memorial afterward was small and intimate. Emma spoke about her father with honest affection and honest acknowledgement of his flaws, describing a man who had given her material comfort but struggled to provide emotional warmth, who had built impressive things but damaged important relationships. Daniel spoke briefly, acknowledging Theodore's business acumen and the hard-won respect they had developed, and thanking Theodore for ultimately supporting rather than destroying his marriage to Emma. In Theodore's will, he left the remainder of his Harrison Industries shares split between Emma and several charities, finally acknowledging that his daughter's marriage to Daniel meant the family's investment stake was secure regardless of what happened to his personal holdings. He left a letter for Daniel that Emma gave him privately, and in it, Theodore wrote things he had probably never been able to say face to face. He wrote that Daniel had proven him wrong about everything, that Daniel's character and capability had nothing to do with his origins and everything to do with who he was fundamentally. He wrote that he was grateful Emma had found a true partner, someone who loved her for herself, rather than her family's money or connections. He wrote that he hoped Daniel would continue to use his influence at Harrison Industries to build something meaningful. The letter ended with words that made Daniel's eyes sting with unexpected tears, Theodore writing that he was proud to have called Daniel his son-in-law, and that he regretted wasting years on prejudice, when they could have been building something better. Chapter 15. Time moved forward as it always does, carrying everyone along in its current. Patricia sold the mansion and moved to a comfortable but modest apartment finally, free from the burden of maintaining appearances that had exhausted her for decades. She developed warmer relationships with Emma and Maria, shedding some of the faded quality that had characterized her during Theodore's life, as though she was finally allowed to become herself again. Daniel's mother Maria lived to see her great-grandchildren, as Maria gave her 2 younger brothers in subsequent years, and she passed away peacefully, in her sleep at 83, surrounded by the family she had worked so hard to protect and nurture through those difficult years. The foundation grew into a major institution, recognized nationally for innovative approaches to breaking cycles of poverty and creating sustainable paths to opportunity. Daniel and Emma hired executive leadership to run daily operations, stepping back to focus on governance and strategy while the organization they had built took on life beyond their personal involvement. They endowed it with enough capital to operate in perpetuity, ensuring that their work would continue long after they were gone. It was the legacy Daniel had wanted, proof that wealth could be used to build rather than just to accumulate, to create opportunity rather than just to signal status. Maria Morgan, their daughter, grew into a remarkable young woman who combined her father's intelligence with her mother's compassion in ways that made both parents proud. She attended a good but not elite university on her own insistence, wanting to earn her achievements rather than have doors opened by family connections. She studied economics and social policy, drawn to understanding systems that created and maintained inequality, and she seemed destined to continue the work her parents had started. Daniel watched her development with amazement and gratitude, seeing her become the kind of person who could inherit wealth without being corrupted by it, who understood privilege as obligation rather than entitlement. Harrison Industries thrived under new leadership, evolving beyond Theodore's original vision while maintaining the core values that had made the company successful. Daniel's investment had grown to over $15 billion as the company's value increased, but the number was abstract, just digits in accounts that represented possibility rather than things he wanted to buy. He and Emma lived in the same house they had bought 15 years earlier, drove practical cars, dressed comfortably but not ostentatiously. To most people who encountered them, they seemed like successful but not extraordinary upper-middle-class professionals, and that was exactly the perception they cultivated because it reflected their values and protected them from the kind of attention and intrusion that made life unpleasant. Daniel occasionally gave interviews or spoke at events, and journalists invariably asked whether he regretted keeping his wealth secret from Emma for those early years. His answer evolved over time, but the core remained consistent. He said that the secret had been born from fear rather than malice, from childhood. Poverty that taught him to trust no one and protect what he had at all costs. He said that revealing the truth had been terrifying and necessary, that his marriage would not have survived indefinitely built on such a fundamental deception. He said that if he could go back, he would tell Emma sooner, would trust her with the truth from the beginning, but that he understood why his younger self had been too afraid to take that risk. He said that marriage required radical honesty even when honesty was difficult, that intimacy without trust was just performance, and that he was grateful every day that Emma had given him a chance to rebuild that trust after he had damaged it so badly. Emma always backed up his account when asked, saying that the betrayal had hurt, but she understood the psychology behind it, that someone who grew up with nothing learned to guard resources and information reflexively. She said that the years of secrecy had been less about lying and more about fear, and that, once the fear was addressed, they had been able to build something genuine and deep. She said that she would not recommend other couples follow their path, that honesty from the beginning was obviously better, but that she also would not trade their particular journey because it had taught them both things about trust and vulnerability that they might never have learned otherwise. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Daniel took Emma back to the coffee shop where they had met, which was still operating with the same scarred tables and temperamental espresso machine. They sat at what they thought was the same table, though they could not be entirely certain, and Daniel pulled out a small box he had been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Inside was a ring, simple and elegant like his grandmother's band, but sized for Emma's finger, designed by a local artisan to reflect her personality and their shared story. He told her that the first ring had been all he could afford and all he could offer, a symbol of hopes rather than certainties. This ring, he said, represented everything they had built together, every challenge they had faced and overcome, every moment of joy, and every instance of choosing to stay and work through difficulty rather than giving up. Emma cried and laughed simultaneously, putting on the ring and holding her hand up to catch the light. And she told him that she would have been just as happy with the first ring if she had known then what she knew now. She said that the money had never mattered, that what mattered was that he saw her as a full person rather than a trophy or a means to an end, that he treated her with respect and kindness and genuine partnership. She said that learning about his wealth had been shocking and painful, but ultimately, it had forced them both to be more honest, and that the relationship they had built after the revelation was stronger than what they had before, precisely because it was built on complete truth rather than careful management. They talked for hours in that coffee shop as the afternoon light faded into evening, reminiscing about their journey and planning for their future. They discussed travel they wanted to do, causes they wanted to support, how to best prepare their children for eventually inheriting significant wealth. They talked about Maria's college plans and whether she would want to be involved with the foundation or forge her own completely different path. They talked about aging parents and aging themselves, about what they wanted their lives to look like in retirement if they ever actually retired from work they found meaningful. The conversation wandered through topics both profound and mundane, the kind of talk that long marriages allow, comfortable and deep, and occasionally punctuated by the affectionate teasing that comes from knowing someone utterly. When they finally left the coffee shop as closing time approached, walking hand in hand to their practical car in the parking lot, Daniel felt the same contentment he had felt periodically throughout their marriage, moments when everything aligned and he understood with perfect clarity that he had built a good life. Not a perfect life. Perfection was an impossible standard, but a good life filled with love and purpose and meaning. He had more money than any person could reasonably need or spend, but that was almost incidental to what mattered. What mattered was that he had broken the cycle of poverty that could have trapped him, that he was using his resources to help others break free too, that He had found a partner who saw him clearly and loved him anyway, that he was, raising children who might make the world slightly better than they found it. Chapter 16. Sometimes Daniel thought back to that night, the birthday dinner when everything changed, and he wondered what would have happened if Theodore had never slid that envelope across the table. Would he still be maintaining his secret, living a double life, letting Emma believe a comfortable fiction? Or would he eventually have found another way to reveal the truth, some less dramatic moment that still forced honesty? He liked to think he would have told her eventually, but he honestly was not sure. Fear had paralyzed him for years, and it had taken Theodore's cruelty to shock him out of paralysis. The envelope itself, that separation agreement offering $500,000, had been burned by Emma in their fireplace shortly after they reconciled. She had said she wanted no physical reminder of her father's worst moment, no document that represented such complete disregard for her autonomy and her choices. But neither of them could forget what that envelope represented, the contempt behind it, and the assumptions it revealed. Theodore had looked at Daniel and seen someone whose life was so worthless that $500,000 million would be sufficient payment to erase himself from existence. He had looked at his own daughter and seen someone whose judgment was so flawed that she needed her father to buy her freedom from her own mistake. That moment had been a test, though not the kind Theodore intended. Theodore meant it as a test of Daniel's character, assuming that everyone had a price and this would reveal Daniel's. Instead, it became a test of Theodore's character, revealing him as someone whose wealth had not brought wisdom or compassion but had instead calcified prejudices and enabled cruelty. The test had also been for Daniel himself, forcing him to decide whether to continue hiding or to finally step into the truth of who he was. He had chosen truth, motivated partly by anger and partly by exhaustion with the lies. And that choice had cascaded into consequences both destructive and constructive. Emma had been tested too that night, forced to choose between her father and her husband, between the family she was born into and the family she had created. She had chosen Daniel, defended him against Theodore's insults, and then had to grapple with the revelation that Daniel had been hiding something fundamental throughout their entire relationship. The fact that she had chosen to rebuild rather than abandon their marriage was a gift Daniel never took for granted. She could have walked away, could have decided the deception was unforgivable, and he would have understood. Instead, she had done the harder thing, working through hurt and betrayal to find a path forward. And that strength was something Daniel admired more than he could ever adequately express. In retrospect, the dinner invitation that had filled Daniel with dread had been exactly what they all needed, though none of them knew it at the time. It had forced issues into the open that could not have remained buried indefinitely without poisoning everything. It had revealed true characters under pressure, showing who people were when they thought they held all the power. It had destroyed comfortable lies and replaced them with uncomfortable truths, and those truths, however painful, had been necessary for any of them to move forward authentically. Daniel sometimes wondered what the younger version of himself would think if he could see the life Daniel had built, the man he had become. That frightened child counting pennies and studying stock prices could not have imagined any of this, the wealth and the family and the purpose. Would younger Daniel be proud, or would he be disappointed that older Daniel had not become even wealthier, had not maximized every dollar, had chosen philanthropy over accumulation? Daniel liked to think younger Daniel would approve, would understand that security was the goal, and everything beyond security was choices about values and legacy. But he also knew that poverty trauma never completely healed, that some part of him would always be that scared kid terrified of losing everything, and that fear shaped his choices even now in subtle ways. Emma caught him in these reflective moods sometimes, and asked what he was thinking about. Usually he told her, had learned that sharing his internal life was essential to the intimacy they had rebuilt. She listened and offered perspectives that helped him process, reminded him that dwelling on the past was less important than being present now, told him that he could not control younger Daniel's hypothetical reactions, but could control current Daniel's choices. She was his anchor in ways that went far beyond the material, keeping him grounded when wealth and influence might otherwise have distorted his sense of reality. Their life together had been built on foundations of sand initially, that deception about his wealth creating instability that threatened to collapse everything. But they had rebuilt on bedrock of truth, and the structure they constructed The second time was stronger precisely because it was tested by adversity. Daniel believed that marriages either broke under pressure or became stronger because of it, that there was no such thing as emerging unchanged from significant challenge. They had emerged stronger, more honest, more appreciative of what they had because they understood how easily it could have been lost. Chapter 17. As Daniel entered his 50s, he found himself increasingly in the role of mentor to younger people, trying to navigate their own paths. Many approached him for investment advice, wanting to know how he had built such wealth, what strategies they should follow, what stocks they should buy. These questions always frustrated him because they missed the point entirely. He explained repeatedly that his success had come not from some secret formula or brilliant insight, but from disciplined research, patient long-term thinking, and tremendous luck regarding timing and circumstances. He explained that chasing quick returns typically led to losses, that real wealth was built slowly over decades, and that for every story like his there were thousands of equally smart and hardworking people who tried similar approaches and failed for reasons beyond their control. The questions he preferred came from young people trying to figure out how to maintain their values while pursuing success, how to make money without losing their souls. To them he offered different advice that came from his journey rather than from investment theory. He told them that money was a tool, that it could be used well or poorly but was ultimately neutral. He told them that character developed before wealth would determine whether wealth corrupted or enabled, that the time to figure out your values was before you had resources to violate them. He told them that secrets had weight, that every lie or omission required energy to maintain, and that the cost of that energy eventually exceeded any benefit the secret provided. He was honest about his failures too, about the years he had wasted in fear, about the pain his secrecy had caused Emma and the trust that had been damaged by his deception. He told them that he had made serious mistakes despite good intentions, that fear was not an excuse even if it was an explanation, that he wished he had been braver earlier. He told them about the dinner with Theodore, about the envelope and the separation agreement, and the moment when he decided to stop hiding. He told them that sometimes you had to break things to fix them, that truth was almost always better than comfortable lies even when truth was terrifying. Young people resonated with these stories in ways that surprised Daniel. They told him they appreciated his honesty, that most wealthy people they encountered acted as though success was an inevitable consequence of their superiority, rather than result of complex factors including luck. They appreciated that he acknowledged his advantages while also owning his efforts, that he did not pretend poverty was just a character-building phase, or that anyone could replicate his path if they just tried hard enough. He became known as someone who would tell you the truth rather than what you wanted to hear, and his mentorship was sought after because it came without ego or agenda. Emma developed her own following of people, particularly women who were trying to figure out how to navigate relationships where financial power was imbalanced. She spoke openly about discovering Daniel's wealth, about the betrayal she felt and the work required to rebuild trust, about the complexity of loving someone who had lied about something fundamental. She did not present their story as a romance or a fairy tale, but as a realistic depiction of how relationships survived failures through deliberate choice and hard work. She talked about setting boundaries with her father, about refusing to let his wealth and authority dictate her life choices, about the price she paid for that independence, and why it was worth paying. Together they modeled a kind of wealthy life that was unusual, refusing most of the trappings that typically came with their net worth, remaining engaged with communities and causes, rather than retreating into insulated luxury. They were not perfect, Daniel reminded people frequently. They made mistakes, and had conflicts, and dealt with the same human struggles everyone faced. But they tried to live according to their stated values, which was harder than it sounded when you had resources to insulate yourself from consequences, and when society rewarded displays of wealth rather than thoughtful stewardship. Their children grew up watching this model, seeing parents who had wealth but did not worship it, who gave generously and lived modestly, who valued character over status and substance over appearance. Maria, their eldest, was developing into a thoughtful young woman who seemed to be absorbing these lessons, and her brothers showed similar groundedness despite the privilege of their upbringing. Daniel knew that parenting children of wealth was its own challenge, that Statistics showed second and third generations often squandered inherited fortunes, but he hoped that by being honest about money's proper place in life, they were giving their children tools to handle it responsibly. He set up trust structures that would give his children access to resources but not unlimited funds, wanting them to work and find purpose rather than simply living off investments. He involved them in philanthropic decisions from relatively young ages, teaching them to evaluate organizations and think about impact rather than just writing checks to feel good. He was preparing them for the reality that they would be wealthy adults, trying to equip them with mindsets and skills to handle that reality without being destroyed by it. Whether he was succeeding would only be evident decades hence, but he was doing his best with imperfect knowledge and good intentions. Emma worried sometimes that they were not doing enough, that their comfortable life represented failure to fully commit to the values they espoused. She wondered whether they should give away everything, live truly simply, eliminate the gap between their philosophy and their lifestyle. Daniel understood these worries because he shared them, but he also believed in sustainable approaches that could be maintained long-term rather than dramatic gestures that burned out quickly. They had found a balance that worked for them, living well below their means while directing the majority of their wealth toward impact, and he thought that balance was more effective than either extreme of ascetic poverty or ostentatious consumption. Chapter 18. One of the unexpected developments of Daniel's later years was watching how his story inspired others to think differently about wealth and secrecy. Multiple articles and even a book had been written about the anonymous investor, who lived simply, analyzing his investment strategy and philanthropic philosophy. While some coverage was critical, focusing on his deception and questioning his motives, much of it was thoughtful exploration of why someone might choose anonymity and simplicity over the recognition and luxury that wealth typically purchased. The story seemed to resonate particularly with people who felt alienated by wealth culture, who had money but felt uncomfortable with how other wealthy people behaved. Daniel started hearing from other wealthy individuals who had been inspired to increase their giving or to reconsider how they lived. A tech entrepreneur wrote to say that reading about Daniel's journey had made him realize he had become exactly the kind of person he had despised before getting rich, and he was working to realign his life with earlier values. An inheritance recipient wrote that she had felt trapped by guilt and obligation around family wealth. But seeing how Daniel and Emma approached their fortune gave her permission to chart her own path. These messages moved Daniel deeply, suggesting that being public about his unusual choices had impact beyond just his direct philanthropic work. The Foundation's model of comprehensive support rather than just financial aid had been adopted by other organizations, creating ripples of impact that extended far beyond their direct reach. Studies showed that this approach was significantly more effective than traditional scholarship programs, and philanthropists increasingly directed funding towards similar models. Daniel felt proud that they had contributed to evolving how charitable work was done, that they had demonstrated approaches that others could learn from and adapt. This kind of systemic influence felt as important as helping individual students, because it multiplied impact across thousands of lives that their foundation would never directly touch. Harrison Industries under new leadership had become increasingly focused on sustainability and social responsibility, partly because of Daniel's influence as major shareholder, but also because markets were rewarding companies that took these issues seriously. Theodore's death had allowed the company to evolve beyond his conservative vision, taking bigger risks and pursuing opportunities that Theodore would have rejected as too uncertain. The result was a company that was both more profitable and more aligned with values Daniel cared about. Proof that doing good and doing well were not mutually exclusive as business critics often claimed. Daniel remained the largest shareholder, but had gradually reduced his position over the years, diversifying into other investments and funding the foundation's endowment. His stake was now closer to $8 billion than $15 billion, though the company's continued growth meant the absolute number kept rising even as his percentage ownership fell. He no longer participated in every board decision, trusting the leadership team and only engaging on major strategic questions. This gradual stepping back felt appropriate as he aged, allowing new perspectives and voices to shape the company's direction. His reputation in investment circles had evolved into something like legendary status, though Daniel found this embarrassing and tried to downplay it. He was not a genius or a visionary, just someone who had been disciplined and fortunate. But people wanted heroes and success stories, and his narrative fit that need. He tried to use the attention productively, speaking about issues he cared about and redirecting interview questions, from his investment success to the systemic failures that made his story unusual rather than universal. If he had a platform, he was determined to use it to advocate for changes that would help others rather than just celebrating his own achievements. Emma had written a memoir about their relationship and the revelation of Daniel's wealth, a thoughtful exploration of trust and betrayal and rebuilding that had become unexpectedly popular. She did not sensationalize the story or present it as entertainment, but rather used their experience as a lens to examine how money affected relationships and how couples navigated imbalanced power dynamics. The book resonated particularly with women who felt they had lost themselves in marriages to wealthy men, and Emma received countless letters from readers thanking her for articulating feelings they had struggled to express. She donated all proceeds to organizations supporting financial literacy and independence for women. Their marriage at this point was comfortable in the best sense, the kind of deep partnership that developed over decades of shared experience. They knew each other's patterns and moods, could communicate in shorthand, occasionally annoyed each other, in the way that long familiarity enabled, but fundamentally appreciated the life they had built together. The crisis of revelation was far enough in the past that it no longer dominated their relationship, though the lessons from it remained relevant. They had learned that honesty was not just about avoiding lies, but about actively sharing truth, even when truth was uncomfortable, and they practiced that learning in countless small ways. Daniel's health remained good as he aged, the comfortable life and lack of financial stress apparently contributing to longevity in ways his mother's hard life had not afforded her. He exercised regularly, ate well, managed stress effectively, had access to excellent health care that caught problems early. He recognized these advantages as privileges that most people lacked. More evidence of how wealth conveyed benefits far beyond material possessions. Every additional healthy year felt like a gift. Time to spend with grandchildren, who were starting to arrive as Maria and her brothers built their own families. Time to see the impact of decades of philanthropic work. Time to simply be with Emma and appreciate the unlikely journey they had traveled together. Chapter 19. When Maria, their daughter, turned 25 and graduated from a policy program with honors, Daniel asked her to have a serious conversation with him and Emma about her inheritance and her future. She would be receiving access to a trust fund that would make her independently wealthy, not billions but millions. Enough that she would never have to work for money if she chose not to. Daniel wanted to talk about that reality before she accessed the funds, to share wisdom from his own experience and to understand what she wanted from her life. They met at a quiet restaurant, just the three of them, and Daniel started by asking Maria what she knew about his childhood and his path to wealth. She recounted the story accurately, demonstrating she had paid attention over the years, and she said she was grateful he had shared the hard parts, rather than just the triumphant ending. She said it helped her understand that money was ultimately just luck, plus timing, plus effort rather than evidence of superiority, and that understanding shaped how she thought about her own privilege. Daniel felt proud hearing her articulate this, evidence that despite his fears, they had successfully passed on values that might protect her from wealth's corrupting influences. He told her that the money she was about to access came with no strings attached, that she could spend it however she chose, and neither he nor Emma would judge her for her decisions. But he also wanted her to understand some truths that only came from experience. He told her that money could not buy happiness, but it could buy freedom from certain kinds of suffering, that having resources meant she could take risks without catastrophic consequences, that she could afford to work for purpose rather than paycheck. He told her that the hardest part of having wealth was maintaining relationships with people who did not have it, that money created distance and suspicion unless handled very carefully. He told her that she would learn who her real friends were when people knew she was rich, that some would treat her differently, and that difference would hurt even if it was understandable. Emma added her own perspectives, talking about how she had grown up with wealth and had seen how it affected her parents' marriage and her father's character. She told Maria that the key was remembering that money was a tool rather than an identity. that she was not her bank account, but a person who happened to have resources. She said that giving generously felt better than spending lavishly, that experiences mattered more than possessions, that maintaining connections to people and communities kept you grounded in reality. She told Maria that she was proud of who her daughter had become and trusted her to handle wealth responsibly, but wanted her to know that she and Daniel would always be available to talk through decisions or concerns. Maria listened thoughtfully and then shared her own plans. She had been thinking about this for years, she said, knowing that wealth was coming and trying to prepare mentally and emotionally. She wanted to work in policy affecting poverty and inequality, using her education to try to change systems rather than just helping individuals. She wanted to live modestly relative to her resources, staying connected to communities that needed change, rather than insulating herself in wealthy enclaves. She wanted to give away at least half her wealth over her lifetime, funding organizations and causes that aligned with her values. She was not trying to be a martyr or to reject their gift, but she wanted to use resources purposefully rather than letting them accumulate pointlessly. Daniel felt emotion well up in his throat hearing his daughter articulate a vision so aligned with his own values, while also being distinctly her own. She was not just parroting what he and Emma had taught her, but had synthesized those lessons into her own philosophy. He told her he was proud beyond words, that she had become exactly the kind of person he had hoped to raise, someone who understood that privilege created obligations. He said that she would make mistakes and face challenges he could not anticipate, but that he had confidence she would navigate them well. He said that his greatest legacy was not the wealth he had accumulated, but the children he and Emma had raised, and that Maria's character was worth more than any portfolio. Emma was crying openly by this point, and she reached across the table to take Maria's hand. She told her daughter that watching her grow up had been the privilege of her life, that Maria had exceeded every hope and dream she had held. She said that parenting children of wealth had been terrifying, that every decision felt weighted with the possibility of creating entitled monsters, and that Maria's groundedness was proof they had done something right. She said she was excited to see what Maria would build with her life and her resources, and that she and Daniel would always be there to support her choices. They talked for hours that evening about specific challenges Maria might face, about how to evaluate organizations asking for funding, about how to navigate relationships when people knew she had money, about managing investment and spending in sustainable ways. Daniel shared stories of his own mistakes and learning, times he had trusted the wrong people or made poor decisions about giving, trying to compress decades of experience into lessons Maria could learn from. They discussed whether Maria should be public about her wealth or maintain privacy, weighing advantages and disadvantages of each approach. Maria was leaning toward selective privacy, being open with people close to her but not broadcasting her financial status widely. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Maria thanked her parents for the conversation and for their honesty over the years about money and privilege. She said many of her wealthy peers had parents who never talked about money except to instill anxiety about not being rich enough, who modeled unhealthy relationships with wealth that their children absorbed. She said she felt fortunate to have parents who treated wealth as a responsibility and a tool, rather than as validation of worth. She said she hoped she could be as thoughtful about her own money as they had been about theirs, and that if she had children someday, she hoped she could pass on the values they had given her. Daniel drove home with Emma that night feeling peaceful in a way that had nothing to do with portfolio balances or philanthropic impact. They had raised a daughter who was going to be okay, who would use her advantages to make a difference rather than just to make herself comfortable. That felt like success in the most fundamental sense, evidence that the cycle he had broken when he escaped poverty would remain broken, that the trauma and scarcity mindset that had defined his early life would not be passed down through generations. His children would have their own challenges. Privilege created its own difficulties, but they would not know poverty's specific cruelty, and for that Daniel felt gratitude so deep it was almost spiritual. Chapter 20. As Daniel approached 60, he began thinking more seriously about mortality and legacy and what he wanted his life to have meant. The foundation was secure, his children were launched successfully, his marriage was strong, his fortune was being deployed thoughtfully. By most measures he had succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. had built a life of meaning and impact from origins that suggested failure was more likely. But there was one final truth he needed to confront, one last piece of honesty. That felt important, even though it would serve no practical purpose. He decided to write a comprehensive memoir, not for publication but for his family. A complete account of his journey, including parts he had never shared publicly. He wrote about the shame of poverty, about going to school hungry and pretending he was not, about his mother's tears when she could not afford his school supplies, about the rage he had felt at a world that valued profit over people. He wrote about discovering investment as an escape route, about the obsessive studying, and the calculated risks and the terror that failure would mean permanent poverty. He wrote about watching his mother get sick and feeling powerless, about the promise she made him extract to continue his education, rather than working to support her. He wrote about building his fortune in detail, including the lucky breaks and the times he almost failed, the moments when different choices would have led to completely different outcomes. He wrote about the day he learned Harrison Industries' value had made him a billionaire on paper, about the surreal emptiness of that moment when he had expected to feel triumphant, but instead felt only numb. He wrote about the decision to maintain anonymity, about the fears, both rational and irrational, that drove that choice, about how the secret had become increasingly burdensome over time. He wrote about meeting Emma with complete honesty, describing his instant attraction, and his growing love and his mounting dread as he realized who her father was. He wrote about all the times he almost told her the truth and the fears that stopped him every time. He wrote about family dinners with Theodore, about the contempt he endured, and the dark satisfaction of knowing he controlled Theodore's company while Theodore treated him like trash. He wrote about the birthday dinner and the envelope and the moment he decided to reveal everything, describing his mixture of rage and calculation and desperation. He wrote about the aftermath with raw honesty, about Emma's justified anger, and her difficult choice to rebuild rather than abandon their marriage. He wrote about confronting Theodore at the board meeting and the strange evolution of their relationship from enemies to something like mutual respect. He wrote about fatherhood and philanthropy, and the ongoing work of trying to live according to values rather than just accumulating more wealth. He wrote about mistakes and regrets, about all the things he would do differently if he could go back, about the things he was proud of and the things that still caused him shame. The memoir took him 2 years to write, working on it in early mornings before the rest of the house woke, and when he finished it ran over 1,000 pages of detailed introspection. Emma read it first and cried multiple times, telling him it was beautiful and painful and honest in ways that scared her. She said some parts were hard to read, forced her to relive the betrayal she had felt when his secret was revealed, but that overall it helped her understand him even more fully. She said their children should read it when they were ready, that it was a gift to give them such complete honesty about his journey. Daniel gave copies to Maria and his sons when they reached their 30s. Old enough to absorb the complexity without being damaged by it. Their reactions varied, but all were moved by his candor, by his willingness to show them his failures alongside his successes. Maria told him that reading about his childhood had made her cry, that she had known the facts but had not really understood the emotional reality of that poverty. She said it made her more committed to her policy work, more determined to change systems that trapped children in circumstances they could not control. His sons expressed similar reactions, thanking him for trusting them with the full truth. He also sent a copy to Theodore's widow Patricia, who read it and called him in tears. She said she was sorry she had not protected Emma from Theodore's cruelty, that she had been weak and complicit when she should have been brave. She said reading Daniel's account of that birthday dinner had made her ashamed of her silence, had forced her to confront her own failures as a mother and a spouse. Daniel told her gently that he had not written the memoir to shame anyone but to record his truth, and that he understood how difficult it was to stand up to someone like Theodore. He said that she had been kind to him in her limited way, and that he bore her no ill will. They talked for over an hour that day, achieving a level of honesty their relationship had never held before. The memoir became a kind of moral will, a document that explained not just what Daniel had done, but why he had made the choices he made. He hoped it would help his descendants understand where they came from, would prevent them from developing the kind of origin mythology that wealthy families often created where everything was inevitable and deserved. He wanted them to know that fortune was random, that different choices or timing would have led to completely different outcomes, that there was nothing inherently superior about their family beyond the luck of having him as an ancestor. He wanted them to feel grateful rather than entitled, obligated rather than privileged. In his final years, Daniel gradually withdrew from business and focused entirely on family and philanthropy. He walked his daughter down the aisle at her wedding, held grandchildren who would never know poverty, watched his sons build careers and families. He and Emma traveled to places they had always wanted to see, taking time to simply be together without the press of work obligations. They talked about their journey often, marveling at how unlikely it had all been, how many things could have gone differently, how fortunate they were to have found each other despite the complications. The foundation they had built continued growing in impact and reach, now supporting tens of thousands of students annually and expanding into other areas of poverty intervention. The organization had taken on a life independent of its founders, run by talented staff who were innovating beyond what Daniel and Emma had originally envisioned. Daniel attended board meetings occasionally but mostly stayed out of the way, trusting the people they had hired to carry the mission forward. He took quiet satisfaction in seeing his initial vision evolve and improve, proof that the work would outlast him. Epilogue. Daniel Morgan died at 73, peacefully in his sleep, his wife of 46 years beside him, and his children and grandchildren nearby. He had lived long enough to see the foundation's impact multiply across generations, long enough to watch his children become the kind of adults who used privilege responsibly, long enough to feel confident that the work he and Emma had started would continue long after they were gone. His funeral was attended by thousands, from business leaders to students whose educations he had funded to people whose lives had been touched by his philanthropy. The diversity of the crowd would have pleased him, evidence that he had lived a life that reached beyond any single circle or community. The obituaries struggled to capture him, reducing a complex life to simple narratives about the anonymous billionaire or the investor who lived simply. But people who had actually known him remembered something different, remembered his kindness, and his intensity, and his absolute commitment to using advantages to help others. They remembered someone who had escaped poverty without forgetting what poverty felt like, who had accumulated wealth without worshiping it, who had made serious mistakes but worked genuinely to repair damage those mistakes caused. Emma lived another decade after Daniel's death, continuing their philanthropic work and writing extensively about his life and their journey together. She never remarried, telling friends that Daniel had been her person, and she had no interest in trying to replace him. She died at 85, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of whom carried forward some piece of the values she and Daniel had tried to instill. The foundation they built continued operating, now one of the largest and most effective in its field, touching millions of lives across multiple generations. Their story became a case study in business schools and philanthropy programs, analyzed for its lessons about wealth management and family dynamics and the psychology of secrecy. Some focused on Daniel's investment success, trying to decode his strategy. Others focused on the philanthropic model he and Emma developed, studying their approach to measuring impact. Still others examined the relationship dynamics, the secret and the revelation and the rebuilding of trust. Everyone found different lessons in the narrative, seeing reflections of their own values and concerns. But perhaps the most important legacy was the simplest one, the proof that wealth did not have to corrupt, that success did not require abandoning values, that privilege could be wielded as a tool for justice, rather than as a weapon of class warfare. Daniel Morgan's life demonstrated that someone could escape poverty and become extraordinarily wealthy while remaining fundamentally decent, could build an empire while maintaining humility, could accumulate billions while living modestly. His life proved that the person you were before money could survive the acquisition of money if you were deliberate and disciplined and honest about the challenges. The children and grandchildren he left behind carried forward his commitment to using wealth responsibly, each in their own way. Some followed him into business and investment, using analytical skills he had helped develop in them. Others pursued policy and activism, working to change the systems he had navigated so successfully. Still others chose creative paths or scientific research or teaching, funded by trusts that gave them freedom to pursue passion rather than paycheck. None of them became billionaires on their own, but all of them lived lives of meaning and impact, which was ultimately what Daniel had wanted most. In the end, the story of Daniel Morgan was not really about money at all, though money was the mechanism that made everything else possible. Thanks for watching. Take care. Good luck.